Picture this, the dying moments of a war that has consumed the galaxy for nearly a decade. Billions upon billions are dead. Entire worlds have been reduced to ash and silence. The greatest civilization humanity has ever built is splintering at the seams, and at the very heart of that catastrophe, aboard the traitor flagship Vengeful Spirit, the most beloved of the Emperor's sons draws his last breath. This is the moment the entire setting of Warhammer 40,000 bends around. Not the Emperor's wounding, not even Horus's death, but the death of Sanguinius, the great angel, Primarch of the Blood Angels, the being who carried within him the brightest combination of everything the Emperor had ever hoped to give to his children. His death is the wound at the center of everything. The psychic scream that erupts from his dying soul still echoes across the gene seed of his sons 10,000 years later, driving otherwise noble and disciplined warriors into states of berserk madness, from which there is no recovery. His death is the reason an entire family of Space Marine chapters has lived for millennia, with a slow curse gnawing at their bloodline, something irreversible, something that gets worse with each passing generation. And yet, there is a question that fans have been asking for decades. A question so fundamental that it almost hurts to think about. What if he had survived? Not in the sense of some miraculous deus ex machina, where everything fixes itself with a wave of golden wings, but seriously, thoughtfully, with all the weight the lore deserves. What if Sanguinius had walked out of that confrontation with Horus wounded but breathing? What if the Vengeful Spirit had carried a living angel back into the void instead of a corpse strung up by demons? What would that one change have done to 10,000 years of galactic history? That is exactly what we are going to explore today, and I want you to get comfortable, because this is going to be a long one. Get your drink, settle in, and let yourself sink into it, because we are going to take this apart, piece by piece, and examine what the survival of Sanguinius would have meant for the Imperium, for his sons, for his brothers, and for the grim darkness of the far future itself. To do that properly, we need to go back to the iron corridors of the most infamous warship in human history, and feel the weight of what actually happened there. The siege of Terra had been going on for weeks by the time Horus finally made his fatal move. His armies had hammered the walls of the Imperial Palace with everything they had. Titan engines tore holes in fortifications that had stood as monuments to human ingenuity. The traitor legions, 9 of them in their full terrible power, pushed the defenders back through corridors and ramparts that were stacked with the dead. The Blood Angels had played a decisive role in that defense. 3 times the enemy had scaled the walls, and 3 times Sanguinius had led them back. He had been fighting continuously, burning energy he could not replenish, taking wounds that would have killed any lesser being 100 times over. He had also been carrying something else, something invisible, but far heavier than any physical wound. He had seen this moment coming. His precognitive visions, the same gift that had haunted him throughout the Horus heresy, had shown him exactly what awaited him aboard that ship. He knew he was going to die. He had shared that vision with Gilliman and Lionel Johnson during the dissolution of Imperium Secundus. He had looked his brothers in the eyes and told them he had seen the manner of his own ending, and he had gone to face it anyway. That is the part of Sanguinius that sets him apart from almost every other figure in this setting. It was not blind courage. It was not ignorance. He walked onto that ship with open eyes, knowing the face of his death, and he walked anyway because he believed the cause was worth it. The lore even records that Horus tried to turn him at the last, tried to appeal to their old friendship, the deepest bond any of the Primarchs had ever shared, and Sanguinius refused. He would not become what Horus had become. He would not trade his son's future for power. The battle was brutal by any measure. Sanguinius, already exhausted and carrying injuries from the siege, went up against Horus at what the lore consistently describes as the absolute peak of the War Master's power. Horus had been invested with the power of all 4 Chaos gods simultaneously. He was not simply a corrupted Primarch anymore. He was something approaching a living avatar of ruin itself, a being that had stepped so far beyond the mortal frame that the air around him darkened and the reality of the ship bent under the weight of what he had become. And yet, Sanguinius fought him hard enough and long enough that he managed to crack Horus's armor, leaving a wound in the blessed ceramite that the Emperor would later exploit to end the War Master's life. Then Horus reached into the warp and dragged his brother down, and it was over. What followed was the psychic death scream. Every blood angel in the galaxy, every son who carried Sanguinius's gene seed, felt the moment their father died. The lore describes it as a wave of anguish and rage that crashed through the Legion like nothing any of them had ever experienced. Some of them lost their minds on the spot. Many of them would never fully recover. And embedded in that death scream, imprinted into the very genetic memory of the Blood Angels from that moment forward, was the experience of those final moments. The feeling of Sanguinius's wings breaking, the sensation of Horus's grip closing, the unbearable knowing that this was the end, and there was nothing to be done about it. That psychic imprint became the Black Rage, and the Black Rage has been killing the sons of Sanguinius ever since. So, the question before us is this: what if that scream had never happened? What if Sanguinius, by the narrowest margin imaginable, had found a way to survive? If you have thoughts already, if you have your own take on what a surviving Sanguinius would have changed, drop it in the comments right now. Tell me where you are in the world, what time it is where you are watching this, and what you think the survival of the Great Angel would have meant. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button. There is a lot more lore where this is coming from, and you do not want to miss it. Let's get into it. Section 2. Who was Sanguinius? The Angel Reborn. Before we start reshaping history, we need to sit with the real Sanguinius for a while. Not the icon, not the martyr saint that the Imperium of the 41st millennium worships in temples across a million worlds. The actual Primarch, with all his contradictions and his depth, and his particular kind of beauty that was completely unlike anything else in this setting. Because the thing about Sanguinius is that he is almost too good to be true. And when something is almost too good to be true in Warhammer 40,000, that usually means it is sitting on top of something very dark. And with him, it absolutely is. Start with the physical. Even among Primarchs, who are all superhuman beyond any reasonable standard, Sanguinius was something else. He stood in full golden plate, wearing the regalia resplendent, adorned with rubies that represented Terra and the moons of Baal, and he carried himself with the kind of presence that made experienced warriors stop what they were doing and stare. He was described as perhaps the most handsome of all the Primarchs, and that is saying something in a lineup that includes Fulgrim, who essentially made beauty into a personal obsession. His face had a quality that people kept reaching for religious language to describe. When the Emperor first arrived on Baal and watched Sanguinius address his people, he stood in the crowd in disguise and listened. That tells you something. The Emperor, who never made himself small for anyone, chose to watch from among the common people, because what Sanguinius was doing on that mountaintop was worth watching. And then there were the wings. White, enormous, functional, completely improbable from a biological standpoint, and utterly impossible to ignore. Whether they came from the Emperor's deliberate design or from the high radiation of Baal warping his development as a child, nobody knows with certainty. But they were real, and they worked, and when Sanguinius took to the skies above a battlefield in full power armor, with those wings fully extended, he looked like nothing so much as the kind of divine messenger that pre-imperial religions had spent thousands of years painting on ceilings and carving into stone. He looked like the kind of being you would build a religion around if you did not have a rule against it, which is part of why the early Imperium found him so complicated. On the surface, Sanguinius represented something the Emperor's secular vision of humanity absolutely did not want to encourage. He was divine-looking. He inspired awe. His people on Baal worshipped him as a god before the Emperor even arrived, and he had not been able to stop them because he was a 10-foot-tall winged demigod on a planet full of mutant survivors, and the option of them not worshipping him was simply not available. The Emperor agreed to leave the people of the pure blood in peace when he came to collect Sanguinius, because Sanguinius asked for it as the price of his service. That was the only Primarch who negotiated, who looked the Emperor in the face and said, "Tell me what happens if I refuse," before he agreed to anything. Every other Primarch just followed. Sanguinius needed to know the terms first. That quality, that combination of absolute loyalty with a clear-eyed willingness to push back on authority when something important was at stake, made him uniquely valuable in the court of Primarchs. He was the one who could talk to Horus and actually get through to him. He was the one who could stand between two warring brothers and make them listen to each other. During the entire heresy period, when he was serving as the reluctant emperor regent of Imperium Secundus, he was constantly mediating the furious disagreements between Guilliman and Lionel Johnson, two beings who had the emotional flexibility of adamantium walls. And he managed it. Not perfectly, not without friction, but he managed it. Horus himself, in one of the most frequently quoted lines in the entire Horus Heresy novel series, admitted that Sanguinius should have been the War Master instead of him. He said it while already corrupted, while already planning betrayal. He said it because even at his worst, even buried under everything chaos had done to him, he could still see that his beloved brother had a quality of spirit that none of the rest of them possessed in quite the same measure. But here is where the darkness lives under all that light. Sanguinius was hiding something for the entire duration of the Great Crusade, through campaign after campaign, through centuries of war alongside his brothers, the Red Thirst. A genetic flaw buried deep in the Blood Angel's gene seed, which manifested as an overwhelming bloodlust, a vampiric craving for blood that grew stronger in the heat of battle and could, if a Marine succumbed to it fully, strip away everything that made them a person and leave only the animal. Sanguinius himself was not immune to it. He felt it. He managed it, suppressed it, controlled it with every gram of his considerable willpower, but it was always there, a darkness running through the veins of everything he had built. He kept it secret from the Emperor and from all his brothers for as long as he could, because he had seen what happened to legions that showed signs of genetic instability. 2 entire legions had been expunged from Imperial records during the Great Crusade, gone, erased. The Primarchs never spoke of them publicly. Sanguinius was terrified that the same fate awaited his sons if the flaw came to light, and so he bore that secret alone, a private shame carved into the gold of everything he appeared to be. The Battle of Cygnus Prime was when it all broke open. Horus sent the Blood Angels into a trap, a system that had been given over entirely to demonic corruption, a hell waiting for them with welcome banners up. At the peak of the fighting, a greater daemon of Khorne named Kabanda, one of the most powerful servants of the blood god in existence, broke Sanguinius's legs and rendered him comatose through a psychic backlash generated by the deaths of hundreds of his sons. And with their Primarch unconscious and the demonic corruption overwhelming their senses, the Red Thirst erupted across the entire legion. They slaughtered indiscriminately. They lost themselves entirely. The secret was out, just not to the Emperor yet, because the witnesses were limited and the aftermath could be managed. That experience of Cygnus Prime changed Sanguinius. He became more desperate to find a cure, more aware that the clock was ticking on his legion's survival, as anything more than barely controlled weapons. He carried that weight alongside the visions of his own death, alongside the burden of command, alongside the knowledge of what Horus had done and what it meant for everyone he loved. And despite all of that, he walked to his death aboard the vengeful spirit with his head up. That is who we are talking about when we say Sanguinius survived. We are not talking about a symbol, or a statue, or a saint. We are talking about a being of enormous complexity, genuine warmth, genuine grief, genuine fear, and the kind of stubborn dignity that refuses to be measured in casualties or victories alone. The question is not just what a surviving Sanguinius would have done differently. The question is what it would have meant for the Imperium to have that kind of soul still walking through it, instead of being frozen into myth. Section 3. The point of divergence, surviving the vengeful spirit. So let us establish exactly how this survival happens, because it matters. This is not about removing Horus from the equation or changing the fundamental shape of the heresy. For this scenario to be meaningful rather than just a complete reimagining, the divergence needs to be as small as possible while still getting Sanguinius out of there alive. The lore gives us actually more flexibility here than you might expect, because the exact manner of Sanguinius's death has been recorded differently in different sources over the decades. The oldest versions of the story have him strangled by Horus. Newer and more detailed accounts from the Siege of Terra novel series show something more complicated, where Horus was holding back, genuinely trying to break his brother down emotionally and make him choose chaos rather than just killing him outright. There was a period, according to the most recent canon, where Horus was not fully unleashing his power because part of him still wanted to turn his oldest and closest friend rather than destroy him. He only went for the killing blow when he detected the Emperor approaching and realized there was no more time. That hesitation is our window. In the standard timeline, Horus detects the Emperor coming and decides to finish it. He reaches into the warp, drags Sanguinius down from mid-flight, bludgeons him with Worldbreaker, and runs him through multiple times with the talon of Horus, the claw that holds the skull of Ferrus Manus. It is a horrifying death, made worse by what it means and who is watching it happen. But what if Sanguinius, despite being badly wounded and exhausted to the point where most beings would have simply ceased to function, managed to use those few extra seconds? What if the crack he put in Horus's armor gave him an opening? A moment where the War Master flinched back from actual pain, real physical damage that the dark blessing of the Chaos Gods had not fully healed yet. And in that moment, Sanguinius got clear, not a clean escape, nothing triumphant. His legs are likely broken or nearly so from the fight with Kabanda. His wings are damaged. He has been fighting for weeks without proper rest, on top of the wounds he took during the siege. Picture him bleeding, barely flying, dragging himself through the corridors of the vengeful spirit toward wherever he could find cover or allies, while Horus turns his attention to the Emperor, and the final confrontation that defines the entire setting begins. The Emperor still teleports aboard. The Emperor still fights Horus. Horus has still been empowered by all 4 Chaos Gods and is still at the apex of his terrible power. The wound that Sanguinius put in his armor is still there, the same crack through which the Emperor will eventually reach and unmake him. The shape of that final fight does not change fundamentally. Horus still batters the Emperor to the point of mortal wounding. The Emperor still digs into that crack in the ceramite and tears Horus's soul apart. But now, somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors of the vengeful spirit, Sanguinius is still alive. He is found, possibly by Rogel Dorn, who the lore confirms was also aboard the vengeful spirit during the assault. Dorn, the Imperial Fist's Primarch, the architect, the unbreakable one, finds his broken brother in some corner of that cursed ship. Sanguinius is alive, but only just. He is conscious enough to understand what is happening around him. He hears, or perhaps feels, through his psychic connection to his sons, the moment the Emperor's light dims and the Golden Throne calls. He survives that moment without dying, without the psychic death scream that would otherwise echo through every blood angel in existence. The Emperor is mortally wounded. The war is won, but the victory comes at the same catastrophic cost. The Emperor is carried to the Golden Throne by Dorn. Malkador, who has been sustaining the device in the Emperor's absence, dies the moment the Emperor takes his place, a sacrifice completed. But Sanguinius is breathing. And that one fact, that single divergence, changes everything that follows. The first and most immediate consequence is biological. There is no psychic death scream. The blood angels across the galaxy experience the moment of near death. They feel their father's agony and terror through the psychic bond that connects a Primarch to his gene sons. But they do not feel the death. The scream that in the original timeline embedded the dying memories of Sanguinius into the gene seed of every blood angel from that point forward never comes. The black rage, as a phenomenon, does not ignite. The red thirst is still there. That was always a pre-existing condition, present in the gene seed before the heresy began. Sanguinius carried it himself, managed it himself. His survival does not erase that particular darkness. But the second and far more devastating flaw, the one that has been slowly destroying the Blood Angels and all their successor chapters for 10 millennia, simply does not exist in the form we know it. We will get into exactly what that means for the Blood Angels in depth shortly, because it is one of the most dramatic ripple effects of the whole scenario. But first, let us follow Sanguinius through the immediate aftermath, because the world he wakes up into is not a comfortable one. He wakes up to find his father on a throne. He wakes up to find Horus dead. He wakes up to find the war over, technically, while the killing continues across the galaxy as the traitor legions scatter and the Great Scouring begins. He wakes up badly injured, his legion shattered by losses from both the siege and the campaign at Cygnus Prime before it. And he wakes up into a political vacuum that nobody quite knows how to fill, with one brother in particular already positioning himself to shape what comes next. His reaction to all of this, knowing who he was, is something we need to think about carefully. Section 4. the aftermath standing over Horus's corpse. Sanguinius wakes in a world where the war has ended, but the grief has barely begun. The imperial palace is a ruin. The walls that Sanguinius defended through 3 enemy assaults are scorched and broken. Tens of thousands of battle brothers are dead. The ordinary soldiers of the imperial army, the Custodes, the Silent Sisters, every faction that fought in the defense of Terra has paid a price that will be counted for years. And somewhere below the mountain of consequences, Sanguinius has to process the fact that his best friend tried to kill him, succeeded in killing him in another life, and is now dead himself. This is not a small thing. The relationship between Sanguinius and Horus was the deepest bond in the entire Primarch fraternity. It predated Horus becoming War Master. Sanguinius spent 3 years learning the ways of the Imperium from Horus and the Luna Wolves before he was ever reunited with his own legion. They fought together, counseled each other, spent centuries as something closer to brothers in the truest emotional sense than most of the other Primarchs ever managed with anyone. Horus, already deep in corruption, admitted that Sanguinius should have been the War Master. He admitted it because even chaos could not entirely erase the love he had for this particular brother. And then he tried to murder him. In the original timeline, Sanguinius does not have to live with that. He dies, and the living have to carry the grief. In this scenario, Sanguinius survives and has to find somewhere to put the knowledge that his closest brother held him down and killed him, except that he didn't, except that he is now dead himself. And the grief and the rage and the love and the loss are all tangled together in a way that would take a being of extraordinary emotional resilience to survive. Good thing Sanguinius was exactly that. The lore is full of evidence that he was the Primarch best equipped to handle impossible emotional weight. He carried the secret of the Red Thirst for centuries. He served as an unwilling emperor of a contingency realm while simultaneously being haunted by visions of his own approaching death. He watched his legion nearly destroy itself at Cygnus Prime and pulled them back from the edge through force of personality and genuine love. He is not someone who shatters easily, but surviving Horus changes him. It has to. The Sanguinius who went to the vengeful spirit was a being who had already accepted his death. He had made peace with it, or as much peace as anyone can make with something like that. Coming out of that confrontation alive does something complicated to a soul that had already said its goodbyes. He is simultaneously grateful and gutted. He has lost the clarity that acceptance of death gives you. He now has to live in a world that is broken and build something in it, and every step he takes is going to be shadowed by what was done to him in those corridors. The immediate political situation he wakes into is this. Rogel Dorn is de facto in charge of whatever is left of Terra's military. Robut Guilliman is still several weeks away with his Ultramarines fleet, which was en route to Terra but arrived after the siege ended. Leman Russ is present. Jagatai Khan is present. The Imperial Fists have the walls. And there is the Emperor on the Golden Throne, technically alive, functionally absent in any meaningful leadership capacity. Malkador, the Sigillite, is dead. He burned away sustaining the Golden Throne in the Emperor's absence during the final boarding action. The Regent of Terra is gone, and the institution of the Administratum that he had been building is young and fragile and desperately needs direction. Into this, Sanguinius walks, or limps. His injuries are severe enough that even a Primarch's regenerative capacity is going to take time to repair the damage. In those early days, he is not the luminous golden warrior descending on gleaming wings. He is something more real and in some ways more powerful than that. A survivor. A being who looked into the face of everything chaos could offer and said no, and still made it back. Dorn, who has never been known for warmth but has always been known for genuine loyalty, keeps Sanguinius alive through the immediate recovery period. There is something almost touching about the image of the two of them together in the aftermath. Dorn, the immovable stone-faced architect, and Sanguinius, the wounded angel, holding the remains of the Imperium together through sheer stubbornness while they wait for Guilliman to arrive, with the numbers and the organizational capacity to actually do something about the catastrophe around them. When Guilliman does arrive, the dynamic shifts immediately, because Guilliman has a plan. Guilliman, as always, has a plan. He has been thinking about what happens after the heresy for years, and he arrives at Terra with the intellectual framework for what will eventually become the Codex Astartes already forming in his extraordinary mind. He sees the wreckage of the Imperium and begins calculating what it will take to rebuild it, to make it stable, to prevent this from ever happening again. What he does not anticipate is that the scenario he built his plans around, the death of Sanguinius, has not happened. Section 5. No Black Rage, the Blood Angels Freed. Let us stop here and really dig into what the absence of the Black Rage means, because this is the single most transformative consequence of Sanguinius surviving, and it deserves the full treatment. In the original timeline, the Black Rage originates from a psychic death scream. When Sanguinius died, the anguish of a Primarch's soul being ripped from existence sent a wave through the warp that touched every single Blood Angel who shared his gene seed. That wave imprinted the experience of his final moments into the genetic memory of the Legion. Essentially, it wrote the memory of dying into the DNA of every future Blood Angel who would ever be created from that gene seed. The result is the Black Rage, where Blood Angels, often on the eve of battle when psychic pressure is high, suddenly lose touch with the present and are dragged back to that moment aboard the vengeful spirit. They become Sanguinius in his last seconds, feeling his pain, his rage, his anguish, and the darkness that closes in at the end. They believe they are him. They believe the war they are fighting is the siege of Terra, and the enemy they face is Horus, and they fight with a transcendent fury that no amount of training or discipline can entirely prepare anyone for. And once the Black Rage takes hold, it does not let go. It is irrecoverable. The Blood Angel is lost. The Death Company exists because of this. Those black-armored warriors, daubed with red crosses, who are given one final glorious charge before the rage kills them or the enemy does. It is one of the most genuinely tragic elements in a setting that runs on tragedy, this chapter that has to send its own brothers to die in every campaign because the alternative is watching them slowly descend into irreversible madness while locked away in the Tower of the Lost on Baal. Without the psychic death scream, this does not exist. The red thirst remains. That was pre-existing, embedded in the gene seed long before the heresy began. Sanguinius himself suffered from it in mild form, suppressed through iron will. His sons will still struggle with it. The vampiric bloodlust in battle will still be present. The Blood Angels will still be the most beautiful and secretly the most tortured space marines in existence, but they will be tortured by something that can be managed rather than something that cannot. And Sanguinius, alive, can actually do something about it. Remember that in the original timeline, one of the things he was most desperate to accomplish, before his death, was finding a cure for the red thirst. He had been working on it covertly throughout the Great Crusade, through the heresy, while simultaneously managing everything else that was happening to him. Without the Black Rage, he can focus that effort on the one flaw that remains, and he can do it as the actual living Primarch rather than as a dead genetic memory. Does he succeed? That is genuinely uncertain. The red thirst is deeply embedded, and its origins are debated even within the canon. Some sources point to the radiation of Baal Secundus interacting with the gene seed during Sanguinius's childhood. Some point to something that chaos touched in him when his nascent Primarch pod passed through the warp as an infant. Some point to the overactive homophagia organ in Blood Angels, which combined with their blood rituals creates a feedback loop that deepens the craving over time. Sanguinius has the most intimate possible knowledge of these mechanisms. He is the source, and he is a genius, and he has time now. Not unlimited time, because Primarchs are not truly immortal in the conventional sense, but time, decades, centuries, if he is careful. He can put his finest minds in the Apothecarion on the problem with his direct involvement, and the odds of making meaningful progress are substantially better than in a timeline where the source of the gene seed is dead, and his only contribution is the psychic scar tissue of his final moments. Speculation territory, clearly labeled. I think he probably doesn't find a complete cure. The red thirst feels too fundamental to the Blood Angels to be removed without destroying something essential about what they are. But I think he finds a way to manage it far more effectively than the original timeline ever managed. A regular ritual, perhaps involving his own blood at intervals, that allows the gene seed to be periodically reset or stabilized. Something that dramatically reduces the rate at which Blood Angels succumb to the thirst's worst expressions. Not a cure, but a management protocol that makes the flaw livable rather than merely survivable. The downstream effects of a black rage-free Blood Angel succession are enormous. First, every successor chapter is also freed from the worst of the curse. The Flesh Tearers, the most extreme expression of what happens when Blood Angel's gene seed goes wrong, do not reach the same breaking point in this timeline. The Lamenters, one of the most consistently unlucky chapters in all of Warhammer history, do not carry the particular genetic time bomb that in the original timeline made them steadily more volatile over time. The Angels Sanguine, the Blood Drinkers, all the varied descendants of the Blood Angels line, carry forward a gene seed that is flawed, but not catastrophically so. This changes the character of these chapters profoundly. The Death Company does not exist, or exists only in vestigial form, as something to honor the Red Thirst's victims rather than the Black Rages. The Blood Angels do not lose brothers to an irrecoverable madness before every major campaign. They can fight longer, recruit more freely, build their numbers without the constant bleeding off of warriors to the flaw. Over 10,000 years, that compounds into something significant. A living Sanguinius also changes what gene seed is available for successor chapters. In the original timeline, the Blood Angels lost their gene seed banks during the heresy, and successor chapters had to be reconstituted from fresh samples taken from Sanguinius's corpse. That meant the psychic imprint of his death was baked directly into every Blood Angel created afterward. With a living Sanguinius, gene seed can be taken from him while he lives, refreshed, renewed, with whatever stabilizing influence a living Primarch provides to the inheritance he passes to his sons. The ripple effects of this extend across the entire culture of the Blood Angels line. The constant low-level grief and guilt that defines the Blood Angels in the original timeline, the sense of being cursed, of being secretly monstrous beneath the beauty, of owing a debt to a dead father that can never be repaid, is substantially different when the father is not dead. The Blood Angels can still be melancholy. They can still be dramatic about mortality in the way that they are. But the particular flavor of self-loathing that comes from the Black Rage, the sense that they are ticking bombs that will eventually destroy themselves, is gone. They become something purer in the best possible sense. Still beautiful, still deadly. Still carrying the weight of the Red Thirst and everything it implies, but not cursed, not doomed, not dying by degrees in a way that no prayer or science can arrest. This matters not just for the Blood Angels themselves, but for the Imperium's relationship with them. Much of the secrecy that the Blood Angels wrap themselves in, the obsessive privacy about their gene seed practices and their recruitment and the Death Company, comes from the desperate need to hide the Black Rage from the Inquisition and from their fellow Space Marines. Without the Rage, that need for secrecy evaporates. The Blood Angels can be more open, more collaborative, more integrated into the broader structure of the Adeptus Astartes. They stop being the brilliant but secretly fragile chapter that everyone worries about, and starts being simply one of the most capable and respected military forces in the galaxy, which is what they always should have been. Section 6. A Voice Among Brothers. The Reconstruction of the Imperium. When Guilliman arrives at Terra with his Ultramarines and his plans and his extraordinary mind for organization, he finds something he was not expecting. He finds the Great Angel sitting up. This changes everything about how the reconstruction goes. In the original timeline, Guilliman essentially had to carry the weight of rebuilding alone among his surviving brothers. Rogel Dorn was difficult, resistant, emotionally destroyed by his failure to prevent the Emperor's wounding and by the loss of Sanguinius. Leman Russ was grief-stricken and furious in equal measure. The Khan and Korax and Vulcan and the Lion were all present in various capacities, but none of them had Guilliman's particular genius for statecraft and logistics. He ended up driving the reconstruction largely through the force of his own intellect and the sheer numbers of his Ultramarines, which were the least depleted of all the Loyalist legions. Now imagine that dynamic with Sanguinius present and healing. Sanguinius and Guilliman are complementary in a way that very few pairings in this setting ever manage. Guilliman is the finest strategic and organizational mind the Imperium has ever produced. He sees systems and structures and the long-term consequences of institutional decisions with a clarity that borders on supernatural. But he is emotionally cold by Primarch standards, not without feeling, but genuinely more comfortable with a spreadsheet of combat doctrine than with the messy human business of inspiring people to believe in what they are fighting for. Sanguinius is essentially the opposite. He is brilliant in his own right, absolutely, but his greatest gifts are in the realm of genuine human connection, in making people feel seen, in bridging gaps between personalities that would otherwise grind against each other indefinitely. He had already done it once, in Imperium Secundus, managing the Guillaume-Lion relationship, which was essentially a small civil war in slow motion happening in the same conference room as him. Together, they could have rebuilt the Imperium in a way that was structurally sound and humanly livable in a proportion that neither could have achieved alone. The first great political crisis of the Reconstruction is the Codex Astartes debate, and this is where Sanguinius's presence makes the most immediate and dramatic difference. The Codex Astartes, for those who need a refresher, was Guilliman's masterwork of military organization. It decreed that the Space Marine legions would be broken up into far smaller, independent chapters of roughly 1,000 warriors each. No single commander would ever again be able to bring the strength of a full legion to bear for personal ambition. It was a direct response to the heresy, designed to prevent any future Horus from commanding the kind of overwhelming military force that made the heresy possible in the first place. The logic was sound. The execution was deeply contentious. Rogel Dorn, in particular, was furious about it. He called Guilliman a coward, citing his absence from the Battle of Terra, suggesting that someone who had not been there for the worst of it had no business restructuring the military around avoiding what happened. The disagreement became so heated that a new civil war seemed genuinely possible, with Leman Russ supporting Dorn and other Primarchs choosing sides. It was only resolved when Dorn went into the Pain Glove for 7 days and came out having accepted the necessity of what Guilliman was proposing. Now put Sanguinius in that room. Sanguinius had already been through exactly this kind of political crisis in Imperium Secundus. He had mediated Guilliman and the Lion when both of them were at their most intractable. He had the credibility with Dorn, with Russ, with every surviving brother, because he had been there. He had held the walls of the Imperial Palace. He had faced Horus and survived it. Nobody in that room could question his right to speak. Nobody could dismiss what he said as the opinion of someone who had not paid the price. And what he would have said, based on everything the lore tells us about his personality, is probably something like this. Guilliman is right about the structure, but wrong about the framing. The problem is not that legions are too powerful. The problem is that the Imperium has no mechanism for ensuring the loyalty and sanity of the beings who command them. The Codex addresses the symptom by distributing power, but the cure is building an Imperium that does not create the conditions for betrayal in the first place. Whether Guilliman would have agreed entirely is another question, but having Sanguinius present means the debate is productive rather than nearly catastrophic. The Codex still probably happens, because its structural logic is compelling, and Guilliman is not wrong about the dangers of concentrated military power. But it might happen with modifications, with protections for the Blood Angels line that acknowledge a surviving Primarch's special relationship with his gene sons, with more input from multiple perspectives, rather than being primarily Guilliman's vision imposed on reluctant brothers. The Blood Angels themselves, in this scenario, probably still split into successor chapters, because Sanguinius can see the wisdom of that even if he mourns it. The deep intimacy of the Legion's structure, the close-knit fraternity of 100,000 warriors who all carry the same genetic inheritance, was something he treasured. He would have fought for exceptions, for the right to maintain closer ties between the Blood Angels and their successors than the Codex technically allows, for the kind of informal kinship structure that the Sanguinary Brotherhood might represent if it had the blessing of a living Primarch, rather than simply being an organic response to a shared genetic curse. During the Great Scouring itself, the 7 years of fighting that followed the heresy's end as loyalist forces drove the traitor legions into the Eye of Terror and cleansed the corrupted worlds they had occupied. Sanguinius's presence changes the tempo of the campaign. He is a warrior of extraordinary capacity, fully committed to the pursuit of every traitor legion, and he has personal scores to settle that go beyond abstract institutional loyalty. He fought Kabanda twice, that greater daemon of Khorne who broke his legs at Cygnus Prime and faced him again at the walls of the Imperial Palace. The chance to put that entity down permanently, or drive it so deep into the warp that it cannot trouble the Imperium for generations, is a genuine motivation. He has seen what the forces of chaos do to the people and places he loves, and the fury that underlies his usual grace is very much present in this period. The scouring in the original timeline is already grimly effective, with Sanguinius leading Blood Angels columns alongside Guilliman's Ultramarines and the other Loyalist forces. The pace of the purge is faster, and the corners they sweep are cleaner. He has a particular gift for identifying the warp-touched, not just through intelligence reports and tactical analysis, but through genuine psychic sensitivity. And in a period when understanding which worlds have been truly corrupted versus which have simply been occupied is the difference between purification and massacre, that ability has enormous practical value. By the time the Great Scouring ends, the traitor legions are in the eye of terror. The Imperium is battered but intact, and Robert Guilliman is not doing this alone. Section 7. A living saint or a living god, Sanguinius and imperial religion. Here is one of the most interesting and underexplored consequences of Sanguinius surviving, and it is the kind of thing that has no clean answer. What does his survival mean for the cult imperialis, the worship of the emperor as god, and the entire religious structure that ends up governing the Imperium's spiritual life? In the original timeline, the imperial cult arose despite the emperor's explicit rejection of being worshipped as divine. He built the entire philosophy of the Great Crusade around the imperial truth, which was essentially secular humanism on a cosmic scale. The idea that humanity should govern itself through reason and courage and science, not through supernatural appeal to higher powers. He hated religion in every form, and then he went on the Golden Throne and could no longer say anything about it, and the cult arose anyway, because a suffering people in a cold and hostile galaxy are going to reach for something to believe in, and the Emperor made a very compelling deity whether he wanted to or not. Sanguinius feeds directly into this. His death is martyrdom in the most literal and classical sense, a beloved figure who gave his life to save humanity from the greatest evil it had ever faced. In the original timeline, temples to Sanguinius rise across the Imperium as a kind of shadow theology that sits alongside the main cult imperialis. The Sanguinala, an annual festival celebrating his sacrifice, becomes a day of remembrance across countless worlds. Blood angels are painted on basilica windows and carved into cathedrals. His martyrdom is so perfect, so cinematically complete, that it practically builds its own devotional tradition. What does this religious landscape look like when Sanguinius is still alive? The honest answer is complicated. On one hand, the religious impulse does not go away. People still worship the emperor. The cult imperialis still emerges for all the same reasons it did in the original timeline. The emperor is on the throne, the legions are divided, the primarchs are departing the stage one by one, and the ordinary human beings managing the apparatus of the Imperium need something to organize their moral universe around. The God Emperor is that something. But Sanguinius cannot be a martyr saint if he is standing in front of you. He cannot be an icon frozen perfectly in the moment of noble sacrifice if he has to make administrative decisions and occasionally get annoyed at political bureaucrats and struggle with his own darkness in ways that real, complex beings do. The mythology that makes him so powerfully worshipped in the original timeline, the perfect angelic death, the sacrifice that mirrors religious imagery from 1,000 human traditions, is not available to him if he survives. And yet he is still a 10-foot-tall being with functional angel wings and a face that people keep reaching for sacred language to describe. He is still someone whose presence in a room makes jaded military veterans feel like the war might be worth fighting. He is still, by any realistic standard, the most obviously divine-looking individual in the entire Imperium, which is saying something when the Emperor exists. The likely outcome is that Sanguinius becomes something genuinely unusual, a living religious figure who is simultaneously trying not to be one. He was never comfortable with the worship his people on Baal gave him, even when he understood why they couldn't help themselves. He would be no more comfortable with it in a galactic context. He would probably argue against the cult imperialis in its more extreme forms, not because he does not respect the Emperor's power, but because he understands what the Emperor himself wanted. And the Emperor wanted people to think for themselves rather than genuflect before an idol. This puts him in an interesting structural position in the early Imperium. He becomes the living counterargument to the most excessive forms of religious authoritarianism that the ecclesiarchy develops. Not because he is anti-religious exactly, but because he is present and visible and a real, living person with doubts and wounds, and a history of making difficult decisions, is fundamentally incompatible with the kind of inhuman perfection that the most zealous forms of imperial religion insist upon. He might, in fact, be the reason the ecclesiarchy develops more moderately than it does in the original timeline. In the world we know, the Adeptus Ministorum eventually becomes the kind of organization that launches the age of apostasy and sees a preacher king named Vandire massacre tens of thousands of his own followers in the emperor's name. In a world where Sanguinius is still around and is credibly positioned to say things like, "The emperor would find this abhorrent because I knew him and he was not that," those excesses become politically harder to sustain. The Sanguinalis still probably exists, but as a living tradition rather than a death anniversary. It becomes something more like a festival of hope, marked by his continued presence rather than his absence. Blood angels are still beloved across the Imperium. Sanguinius is still revered. But the nature of that reverence is different when it has to accommodate a complicated, real, present individual, rather than the crystallized perfection of a martyr frozen at his finest moment. For the Blood Angels themselves, the religious dimension of Sanguinius's survival is the most profound. In the original timeline, they literally carry their dead father's dying memories in their DNA. Their worship of Sanguinius is simultaneously pride and guilt, celebration and grief. The Red Grail, the sanguinary priests, the blood rituals, all of it is built around the absence of someone who should still be here. Their entire devotional culture is shaped by loss. With Sanguinius alive, that culture transforms. He is not a ghost to be honored. He is a father to be answered to, learned from, disagreed with, and sometimes disappointed. That is harder in some ways, and far more alive in others. The Blood Angels become a chapter of sons with a living parent, rather than orphans, building a mythology around someone they never got enough time with. That changes who they are, fundamentally, at the level of identity. And given that the Blood Angels and their successors collectively number thousands of chapters and hundreds of thousands of warriors across the 41st millennium, the ripple effects of that identity shift across the institutions and culture of the Imperium are genuinely vast. Section 8. The Red Thirst. The Wound that Remained. Even with Sanguinius alive, the Red Thirst is not going away. It was there before the heresy. It was there before Cygnus Prime. It was there during the Great Crusade, manifesting quietly in isolated incidents across the Legion that Sanguinius managed by personally executing those who fell too far and keeping the secret from the Emperor. The Red Thirst is woven into the Blood Angels' genetic inheritance in a way that even a living Primarch cannot simply will away. What changes is how it is handled. In the original timeline, the Blood Angels managed the Red Thirst primarily through ritual and through the sanguinary priests, who maintain the blood chalice and conduct transfusion rituals that apparently help stabilize the gene seed's more volatile tendencies. The discipline of the Red Thirst is a real thing, a martial and psychological practice that Blood Angels use to suppress and channel the craving rather than indulging it, and it works well enough that most Blood Angels live their entire operational lives without succumbing. The thirst is managed, mostly, though it is never absent. The problem, which the lore makes clear, is that it tends to get worse over time, both for individual Marines as they age and for the chapter as a whole, as the gene seed is copied through successive generations. The Red Thirst appears to compound, to deepen, to make the struggle harder with every decade and every founding. By the 41st millennium, chapters like the Flesh Tearers are in genuinely dire straits, with their attrition rates from the thirst threatening the chapter's continued existence. Sanguinius, alive, has the opportunity to arrest that process of compounding degradation. Not by curing the thirst itself, but by maintaining a living, stable source of the purest possible version of the gene seed. His own genetic material, taken regularly, provides a baseline that can refresh the most degraded elements in successor chapters' stocks. He becomes essentially a living anchor for the entire Blood Angels gene line, a gravitational center that prevents the drift toward extremity that happens in the original timeline without him. This is actually more important than curing the thirst. A cure that is achieved once and then propagated might have unpredictable effects across thousands of marine generations. A living source of stable genetic material that can be used to recalibrate the gene seed every few centuries is practical, sustainable, and achievable. Does Sanguinius submit to this? The idea of being regularly harvested for blood and genetic material, essentially serving as a biological battery for his son's continued stability, would sit uneasily with anyone's dignity. But knowing what we know about Sanguinius, knowing that he voluntarily bore the weight of his legion's secret shame for centuries, that he personally executed sons who fell to the thirst rather than let them suffer publicly or compromise the legion's existence, the answer seems likely to be yes. He would do it. He would find it humiliating and quietly painful, and he would do it anyway, because that is the kind of being he is. The practical result over 10,000 years is a blood angel's gene line that is still marked by the red thirst, but nowhere near as catastrophically affected as in the original timeline. The flesh-tearers still exist, still carry a particularly acute version of the thirst, but they are not facing extinction. The lamenters are still cursed by bad luck, but not by the genetic deterioration that nearly destroyed them. The blood drinkers still lean into the vampiric aspects of their inheritance, but in a way that is managed by chapter tradition and Sanguinius's direct involvement, rather than purely through internal culture developed in his absence. There is another dimension to this that deserves its own examination. In the original timeline, part of what makes the red thirst so shameful for the blood angels is the secret. The fact that they have been hiding it since before the heresy creates a culture of concealment and secrecy that compounds over time, where hiding becomes second nature and transparency becomes almost impossible, even when it would be beneficial. With a living Sanguinius, the possibility exists that the secret eventually comes out in a more controlled, less catastrophic way. Not as a revelation that shakes the Imperium's trust in the Blood Angels, but as a managed disclosure, where Sanguinius himself decides the time is right to acknowledge the flaw openly, to bring it before whatever council of authority exists in the early post-heresy Imperium, and to present the management protocols that show it is not an existential threat. The Emperor knew, or at least suspected. Horus knew and kept it secret out of brotherly loyalty. Guilliman, with his obsessive thoroughness, probably worked it out on his own during the second founding period. It is not as great a secret as the Blood Angels think it is. In a scenario where Sanguinius can have an honest conversation about it with Guilliman, rather than having it exposed through disaster or political crisis, the flaw becomes a known quantity that can be properly planned for, rather than a hidden vulnerability that enemies can exploit and allies cannot guard against. The difference between a weakness that is acknowledged and managed, and a weakness that is secret and therefore unmanaged, is the difference between a controlled burn and a wildfire. With Sanguinius alive to make the case, the Blood Angels can live with the former rather than the latter. Section 9. 10,000 years later, what would the 41 State Millennium look like? Let us now do the genuinely speculative work of following these changes across 10,000 years and sketching the contours of a 41st millennium that includes a living Sanguinius. This is the deepest territory of the whole exercise, and I want to be honest with you that this is where we leave the established lore behind and really commit to the imaginative space. This is not canon. This is extrapolation from the lore we have, following the logic of the changes as carefully as possible. Start with the Primarchs themselves. In the original timeline, most of the surviving Loyalist Primarchs vanish from the scene within a few centuries of the heresy's end. Guilliman falls into stasis after being poisoned by Fulgrim during the Scouring. The Lion goes to sleep in the heart of the rock, attended by the Watchers in the dark. Leman Russ disappears into the Eye of Terror. Corax dissolves into something like a consciousness of living shadow in the warp. Vulcan wanders, essentially immortal and functionally unkillable, pursuing his own mysterious agenda. The Khan charges into the dark city of Kamara and is not seen again for millennia. Jagatai eventually returns, as does the Lion. But in the 41st millennium, only Guilliman and El Johnson are present, both having only recently returned. The reasons for this disappearance pattern are debated in the lore, but the common thread seems to be that Primarchs are too powerful and too inherently significant to coexist with the human institutions of the Imperium over the long term. Their presence distorts things. They attract attention from chaos. They create hero worship that undermines institutional authority. And their own nature is such that the slow centuries of grinding administrative work that maintaining an imperium actually requires would be suffocating for beings designed for conquest and war. Sanguinius would feel all of that. But his specific personality and his specific circumstances might lead him to a different choice than most of his brothers. The thing about Sanguinius is that he is genuinely emotionally invested in the well-being of individual people in a way that most Primarchs, for all their stated dedication to humanity, are not. He learned the names of his legionaries one by one when he first reunited with them. He executed sons who fell to the thirst himself, personally, rather than delegating it, because he felt he owed them that much. He spent his years as Emperor Regent of Imperium Secundus, actually trying to govern rather than just issue commands, mediating quarrels and hearing petitions, and doing the human-scaled work of leadership rather than just the grand strategic kind. He might stay. Not forever, maybe, but longer than his brothers, longer than any of them expected. He might be the Primarch who is still present at the founding of the Adeptus Astartes chapters, still present when the Inquisition develops, still there when the ecclesiarchy begins to take the shape that will eventually calcify into something the Emperor would have despised, present to push back on the worst of the excesses, present to remind the institutions being built that they are meant to serve humanity, not consume it. Even Sanguinius cannot stop the Imperium from becoming the brutal, terrified, superstitious institution it becomes. The pressures that created Grimdark are too vast and too systemic for any individual, even a Primarch, to simply prevent by remaining in the room. The 10,000-year slow deterioration of the Emperor's dream is something baked into the setting's fundamental mechanics. Warp storms grow stronger. The Astronomicon requires a regular sacrifice of Psykers. The Chaos Gods are always pressing at the boundaries. The Xenos never stop, but the shape of the deterioration would be different. With Sanguinius present through the first millennium after the heresy, the Imperium that crystallizes has at least one voice of consistent, credible, earned authority, insisting on a standard of actual humanist values. He is not naive enough to think the Inquisition is unnecessary. He has faced demons. He knows what chaos can do to a person, a world, a civilization. He is not going to argue against the hard edges of imperial policy in any idealistic way. But he is going to argue, consistently and with evidence, that the hard edges exist to protect humanity rather than to consume it, and that every time the Imperium turns its harshest tools against the people it was built to protect, it undermines the very thing it claims to defend. Whether anyone listens to him over 1,000 years, 2,000, 5,000, is genuinely unknown. The bureaucratic inertia of something the size of the Imperium is crushing. Even Guilliman, returning in the 41st millennium with the authority of both his title and his enormous personality, is struggling to reform it. Sanguinius would face the same resistance. But he is also someone who has never stopped caring, which, in the grimdark context, is actually a superpower. He genuinely loves the humans of the Imperium in a way that is not abstract or strategic. He loves them the way he loved the people of the pure blood on Baal, the mutant survivors of a dying world who built their civilization around the faith that it was worth surviving. He walks into whatever the Ministorum has become in century 500 or century 2000, and he looks at the people in it, and he still sees something worth fighting for. That quality, that genuine emotional engagement with the project of humanity's survival as something more than a military exercise, is rarer than wings. The 41st millennium in this scenario is still dark. It is still full of war and loss, and the relentless grinding tragedy of a civilization holding itself together through brutality and faith, because it does not have any better options. The Great Rift still probably happens, because the Cicatrix Maledictum is driven by forces that predate the heresy and are not going to be prevented by the presence of a single living Primarch. The enemies of humanity, chaos, and the Tyranid hive fleets and the Necrons and the Orcs and all the rest are not going away. But the Grimdark has gradations, and in this timeline, the gradation shifts. The Imperium is still terrible in many ways, but it is not quite as far from the Emperor's actual dream as it is in the world we know. It has had, at various moments, across the millennia, a living reminder of what that dream looked like in someone who actually cared about it. And those moments matter, even if they cannot prevent the long slide, even if they only slow it slightly. In a setting where every victory is temporary and every loss is permanent, slowing the slide matters. The Blood Angels and their successors are the most obviously changed element of the 41st millennium, but the change radiates outward from them into the broader culture and military structure of the Imperium. Chapters that, in the original timeline, are in crisis or near extinction are stable, functional, even flourishing. The Sanguinary Brotherhood is larger, more internally coherent, and better integrated with the broader Adeptus Astartes, because they are not spending significant energy hiding their shame and managing a catastrophic genetic condition. The Blood Angels proper, rather than being perpetually below optimal strength due to the losses of the Black Rage, maintain healthier numbers and can field forces that in the original timeline simply do not exist. Sanguinius himself, by the 41st millennium, might be in one of several states. The most likely, given Primarch longevity and the kind of self-care that someone who has seen what can happen to people who neglect themselves might practice, is that he is present but changed. 10,000 years will mark any soul. The companions he made in the early post-heresy period are dead. His brothers are either in stasis, vanished, or in the rare cases of Guilliman and the Lion, only recently returned. He has watched the Imperium he helped build turn into something he often does not recognize. He has won battles and lost centuries. He has seen sons born and trained and sent to die in wars that stretch across the void. He might be warier than anyone, the particular exhaustion of someone who has cared for 10,000 years and not been allowed to stop. Not mad, not broken, not in the Black Rage, nothing that catastrophic, but marked in the way that only time on that scale can mark you. The gold is still there, the wings are still there, but the eyes carry something that cannot be faked and cannot be hidden from anyone who looks closely enough. The accumulated weight of everything he has seen, and he is still present, still fighting. Still, on the days when the galaxy gives him a reason to remember why it matters, still capable of that particular quality of joy and love that always set him apart from his brothers. Still, the being who could make exhausted warriors believe that tomorrow might be worth reaching. The 41st millennium in this scenario has a heartbeat that the original does not quite manage. Section 10. The Great Rift and the Angel's Answer. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, is the most catastrophic event in 40,000 years of Warhammer history that is not the Horus Heresy itself. It tears the galaxy in half. It drowns half the Imperium in perpetual warp storms that cut off systems from the Astronomicon and from each other. It creates the Noctis Aeterna, the night that lasts for varying periods across different parts of the Imperium, as the light of the Astronomicon is obscured. It is, in almost every meaningful sense, the beginning of the end of the Imperium as we know it, the event that makes Guilliman's return and the Indomitus Crusade not just important, but genuinely existential. In the original timeline, the rift is triggered by the chaos ritual that destroys Cadia, the fortress world that has stood for 10,000 years as the stopper in the bottle of the Eye of Terror. Abaddon, the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade, pushes through. Cadia falls. The pylons that have been suppressing the Eye's expansion are destroyed, and the warp vomits itself across the galaxy in a crack that goes from one edge to the other. None of that changes in our survival scenario. Abaddon is still Abaddon. The 13th Black Crusade is still coming. The pylons on Cadia are still the critical infrastructure whose destruction opens the floodgates. The Cicatrix Maledictum is, in some readings of the lore, essentially inevitable, the culmination of a 10,000-year process that began the moment the Emperor went onto the throne and the Chaos Gods saw their opportunity. What changes is who is there to meet it. In the original timeline, the response to the Great Rift involves Guilliman being resurrected through the combined efforts of the Aeldari, Ynnari, and Belisarius Cawl, who had spent 10,000 years building the technology necessary to heal him from Fulgrim's poison. Guilliman then launches the Indomitus Crusade, taking Primaris Space Marines, the next generation of enhanced warriors that Cawl created, into the void to reinforce chapters decimated by the rift and hold the Imperium together through the Noctis Aeterna. In our scenario, Guilliman presumably never went into stasis in the first place, because Sanguinius was there to handle his own portion of the scouring and the political reconstruction, which means the encounter with Fulgrim that put Guilliman in stasis either did not happen or happened differently. Guilliman, in this scenario, is either still active or has retired from active leadership in some other fashion, or has faced his own challenges that are beyond the scope of what we can detail here. More relevantly, Sanguinius is already present when the rift opens. The battle for Cadia, if it happens along broadly similar lines, now has a Blood Angels Primarch as a potential participant. Sanguinius's reaction to the fall of Cadia would be, based on everything we know about him, exactly what you would expect from someone who has spent 10,000 years watching the Chaos Gods try to consume humanity. It would be the kind of cold, focused fury that his gentler public face rarely shows, but that was always there. The same quality that made him terrifying in battle, the part of him that was pure wrath when something he loved was threatened. The Indomitus Crusade in this scenario takes a different shape. It does not need to be about returning a Primarch from the dead, because one is already present. It might still involve Primaris Space Marines, because the logic of upgrading the Astartes beyond their original parameters has merit regardless of who is alive to oversee it. Call might have been building them under Guilliman's instruction, or under some parallel mandate in this timeline. The new generation of warriors would still need to be fielded, the chapters still need reinforcing, the Shattered Imperium still needs someone to organize the response. Sanguinius, leading the Indomitus Crusade, or a version of it, is a striking image. He does not have Guilliman's specific logistical genius, but he has his own gifts, including the ability to inspire forces to move and fight and sacrifice beyond their measured capability, which in a crisis response situation is worth more than perfectly optimized supply chains. He brings the Blood Angels, and all their successors, to bear with the kind of coordinated purpose that only a living Primarch can generate. He brings the psychic weight of his presence, which in a galaxy where the warp is tearing itself apart around you is not a trivial advantage. He can feel the warp's shape in ways that matter tactically, the places where the rift is thinnest, where it is actively growing, where its currents can be navigated rather than simply endured. There is also a dimension here that connects to the Blood Angels' particular relationship with the warp and with death. The Black Rage in the original timeline is itself a kind of psychic wound, left in the wake of the worst psychic trauma the 30th millennium ever generated. Without the Rage, the Blood Angels in this timeline have a cleaner relationship with the Immaterium, less haunted by echoing death memories, less vulnerable to the particular kind of chaos manipulation that works through grief and loss. In the era of the Great Rift, when the boundary between the Materium and the Immaterium is at its most permeable, this matters. The Blood Angels can operate in areas of intense warp activity that would be psychically catastrophic for other chapters, without losing warriors to the Rage, on top of everything else the environment is throwing at them. The Aeldari relationship also changes. In the original timeline, it is the Ynnari, the death cult faction of the Aeldari, pursuing the resurrection of Ynid, who facilitate Guilliman's awakening. They have a particular interest in the moment because it serves their own theological and political purposes. In our scenario, the Ynnari have no resurrection to facilitate, and their interest in Sanguinius is different. He is, from the Aeldari perspective, something unprecedented, a mortal-born being who by all rights should have died, and who carries the psychic imprint of a near-death experience with chaos at its most potent. That is interesting to the Aeldari in ways that create entirely different political dynamics. Some of the Aeldari factions would see a living Sanguinius as a potential ally against chaos in a way that goes beyond simply sharing a battlefield. His combination of psychic sensitivity, personal experience of the Chaos God's power at close range, and genuine commitment to humanity's survival makes him a rare human figure that the Aeldari can actually engage with on terms that are not entirely transactional. The relationship between the Imperium and the Aeldari in this timeline might be warmer, more complex, more genuinely reciprocal, without being naive about the fundamental differences in their interests. What about the Sanguinor in this scenario? The mysterious golden warrior who appears when Blood Angels are at their most desperate, whose true identity is one of the enduring mysteries of the original lore. In the survival scenario, the Sanguinor's origin is clearly established. It was created during Imperium Secundus, as a practical device, a surrogate who could handle public functions while Sanguinius himself dealt with more pressing matters. Over the 10,000 years of this timeline, it has become something more, touched by the immaterium in ways that transformed Azkaelon or his successor into something that transcends ordinary mortality. Even with Sanguinius living, the Sanguinor persists as something separate, a manifestation of his son's collective belief in their father's ideal self, rather than the complex, wounded, real person he actually is. The coexistence of Sanguinius and the Sanguinor in the 41st millennium is genuinely interesting. The ideal and the real, the myth and the man, both present, both carrying pieces of something the other does not have. Section 11. Could he have saved the Emperor? The Golden Throne question. We have been circling around this throughout the entire discussion, and now we have to face it directly. The Emperor is on the Golden Throne. He has been there for 10,000 years in the original timeline, sustaining the Astronomicon, fighting a perpetual psychic war against the Chaos Gods, keeping a crack in a door that, if fully opened, would pour demons into real space in numbers that would end the species. He is simultaneously the most powerful being in the galaxy and a prisoner of his own necessity, neither dead nor alive, sustained by the daily sacrifice of thousands of psychers. In the original timeline, the question of whether the Emperor can be freed from the throne, whether there is any way to release him without destroying the mechanisms that depend on his presence, has been one of the longest-running debates in 40,000 years of in-universe scholarship and out-of-universe fan discussion. Some faction wants to release him and allow him to die, trusting that his soul will be reborn into a new form that can fight chaos without the constraint of the throne. Others believe the throne must be sustained at all costs. Guillemon, who seems to understand more than most about what the Emperor actually is and what he might become, is characteristically ambiguous on the subject. Sanguinius changes this calculation in ways that are profound and not entirely predictable. First, the question of the throne's engineering. In the original timeline, the Golden Throne was built to be something other than what it became. It was designed as a component in the Emperor's project to create a stable human webway, a network of interdimensional tunnels that would allow humanity to travel without using the warp at all. When Magnus the Red's catastrophic psychic intrusion destroyed the webway project, the throne became a life support system instead, and that was always an imperfect fit. It has been degrading for 10,000 years, and by the 41st millennium, the engineering problems are reaching a crisis point, where the original design is failing in ways that cannot be compensated for much longer. Sanguinius is not a tech priest. He is not Belisarius Cawl. He does not have the mechanical expertise to repair or upgrade the Golden Throne himself. But he has something more important. He has 10,000 years and direct access to the Emperor. This is not nothing. The Emperor on the throne is not fully absent from the material world. He communicates imperfectly, rarely, in dreams and visions and psychic impressions rather than words. The custodes serve him and receive guidance from him. Certain psychers can hear him, or something like him, in the warp. His presence is real, and it reaches into the material world even in his constrained state. Sanguinius, as a powerful psyker in his own right, with a direct familial connection to the Emperor through the gene seed bond, would be better positioned than almost anyone alive to receive those communications clearly. He might be the person who can actually have something approaching a conversation with his father across the boundary of the throne, not a full exchange of information, but something more coherent than the fragmentary impressions most people receive. What does the Emperor want? That is the central mystery of the setting, the question that Guillemon wrestles with in the 41st millennium, and that the narrative of modern 40K keeps circling without fully answering. In the survival scenario, Sanguinius has been asking that question for 10,000 years and receiving whatever answer the Emperor is capable of giving. He has more information than anyone about what the being on the throne actually is and what it is trying to accomplish. Does that information lead to the throne's solution? Probably not entirely, because the problem is technical and biological and warp structural in ways that go beyond what anyone currently living can address. But it might lead to better interim solutions. The psyker sacrifice that sustains the throne is one of the most grotesque realities of the Imperium. thousands of souls burned every day to keep the light of the Astronomicon burning. If Sanguinius has been in conversation with the Emperor long enough to understand what specifically is needed from that sacrifice, there might be ways to make it more efficient, to sustain the same effect with fewer deaths, to buy more time for a real solution to be found. The psychic resonance that Sanguinius established with the Emperor at Cygnus Prime, when the Emperor reached through the warp to strengthen his son against the daemon Kabanda, is a real thing in the lore. That kind of direct connection, even weakened by distance and the Emperor's constrained state, might be maintainable over centuries, in a way that provides genuine intelligence about what the throne actually needs. There is also the question of what happens in this scenario, with the rumored possibility of the Emperor's resurrection. The original lore hints that the Chaos God, Nurgle, and others have been actively working to hasten the Emperor's death, knowing that his soul in the warp, free of the throne, would be the seed of a new god, a fifth power in the pantheon that would be anathema to the four existing ones. The Ynnari, the death-focused Ildari faction, are also involved in this in complex ways related to Ynid. Some scholars in the lore believe the Emperor is already partially divine, that the faith of billions in him is transforming his soul in the warp into something that transcends normal death. Sanguinius, watching all of this for 10,000 years, with his particular combination of psychic sensitivity and genuine love for his father, would not be a passive observer. He would be thinking about it. He would be looking for the mechanism that allows the Emperor to transition from dying prisoner to something that can act again, whether that is resurrection in a new body or some form of apotheosis that allows the psychic being to engage chaos on its own territory, without destroying the throne's functions, or something that has no name yet, because nobody in the original timeline had both the time and the perspective to think it through from scratch. He might not find it. Probably he does not find it in the sense of a complete solution, because the setting would need to deliver that as a major narrative moment, rather than something that happened quietly off-screen. But he narrows the problem. He eliminates approaches that do not work. He builds a body of knowledge about the Emperor's state that does not exist in the original timeline, and he keeps the question alive in a form that actual experts, the Mechanicus, the Inquisition's most enlightened members, the Eldari Farseers who have their own interest in the outcome, can engage with. The Golden Throne question in this scenario does not get resolved in 10,000 years, but it gets closer to resolution. The shape of the answer is clearer. And when the Great Rift happens, and the Indomitus Crusade begins, and the forces of order rally for what might be humanity's final stand, the people who need to make the decision about the Emperor's fate have better information to work with. Whether that means the Emperor returns in this scenario is something I genuinely do not know. The setting's narrative logic suggests that the Emperor's return would be the climax of 40K's story, the moment toward which everything has been building, and it would be strange to have that happen quietly as a side effect of a survival scenario. But the groundwork is better laid. The outcome, when it comes, is less likely to be catastrophic because someone has been thinking about it carefully for 10,000 years rather than mostly just waiting. Sanguinius, standing in the chamber of the Golden Throne, present and alive, where in the original timeline he is an icon on a basilica window, is one of the most poignant images this scenario generates. The son who was supposed to die, standing vigil over the father who was supposed to live, both of them enduring in ways that defy what should have been, carrying the memory of everything lost and the possibility of something still to come. Section 12. Closing thoughts. The weight of wings. We have covered an enormous amount of ground today. We have walked through the moment of Sanguinius's death and imagined his survival. We have followed the ripple effects through the immediate aftermath of the heresy, through the Blood Angels freed from their worst curse, through the political reconstruction of the Imperium, with a voice that would have been missing. We have speculated about 10,000 years of gradual change, about what the 41st millennium looks like when one more light is burning in the darkness that should not be there. We have stood in the chamber of the Golden Throne and looked at what knowing more might mean for the question that has no answer yet. And I think the most honest conclusion, looking at all of it, is this. A surviving Sanguinius does not fix the Imperium. The Imperium is not fixable by any single individual, no matter how extraordinary. The forces that make it dark, the grinding pressure of a hostile galaxy, the limitations of human nature, even in institutions trying to do good, the simple enormity of governing a civilization, spanning millions of worlds across the immensity of space, are beyond any one being's capacity to overcome. The grimdark is structural. It is cosmic. It is, in this setting, essentially the point. But Sanguinius surviving means the Imperium is less alone in its darkness. That sounds small. It is not. One of the most oppressive qualities of the 40K setting as we know it is the sense of absence, the feeling that everything worth having was lost long ago, and what remains is the shell of a dream that nobody living can quite remember clearly enough to rebuild. The Emperor is a prisoner who cannot speak. The Primarchs are gone, mostly, or have returned only recently after missing everything that needed them most. The ideals of the Great Crusade, whatever their flaws, were at least ideals, a vision of what humanity might become. In the original timeline, that vision is dead. It lives only in the text of documents and the memory of the machine, not in any living person who knew it firsthand. In our survival scenario, for 10,000 years, there has been a living memory of what the dream looked like when someone who genuinely believed in it was still around to hold it up. That memory changes how the institutions built in its aftermath develop. It changes the baseline of what is considered acceptable and what is considered too far. It does not prevent the Inquisition from doing terrible things, or the Ministorum from becoming bloated with institutional power, or any of the other processes that make the Imperium what it is by the 41st millennium. But it gives those processes something to push against, a friction that slows the slide. There is also something deeply personal in what Sanguinius's survival means, something beyond the institutional and the political and the military. It means his sons get to have a father. It means the people of the Imperium get to see, in at least some corner of the galaxy, on at least some occasions, what it looks like when something noble doesn't end in tragedy. The Blood Angels do not have to define themselves by a death. The Sanguinala does not have to be a funeral. The name Sanguinius does not have to be spoken in the past tense. In a setting called the Grimdark, where the joke is that there is only war, and the long joke is that even the heroes die badly and nothing gets better, the survival of the Great Angel is a small, stubborn, genuinely hard-won exception to the rule. He did not save the world. He could not. Nobody could. But he kept faith with it long after he had every reason to stop. And in the end, that is what the question was always about. Not whether surviving Sanguinius changes the outcome of the war, or prevents the Great Rift, or solves the Emperor's condition. It is about what it means to choose to care in a universe designed to make caring feel futile. It is about whether the light that should have been lost can sometimes survive, not unchanged, not without cost, but present. The wings are heavy, 10,000 years of carrying humanity's worst war on your back, and still finding reasons to spread them again and rise above it one more time. But they are still there. They were always still there. And that, I think, is worth more than we can easily measure. If you made it all the way through this one, genuinely, thank you. This was a long journey through one of the most emotionally rich what-if questions in the entire 40K setting, and I hope it gave you something to think about. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think the biggest change would be? Do you think the Imperium is better or worse with Sanguinius present? Is the Grimdark something that can be softened by a single surviving Primarch? Or is the darkness structural in a way that even the Great Angel couldn't dent? And if you have been watching this and you are not already subscribed, now is the time. Hit that button. There is more lore, more what-ifs, more quiet journeys through the 40K universe right here. Every single week, something new to sink into. This has been an exploration of what a different ending might have given the Imperium of Man. Until next time, stay warm and watch the skies. Section 13. The Brotherhood of Primarchs. How Sanguinius changes the family. To understand the full scope of what a surviving Sanguinius means for the Imperium, we also need to examine what he means for the other Primarchs who are still present in the immediate aftermath of the heresy. Because those relationships, the specific bonds and tensions and histories between the brothers who are left, define much of what the Reconstruction period looks like and how it unfolds. Start with Rogel Dorn. Dorn and Sanguinius were not as close as Sanguinius and Horus, but they had a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and a shared willingness to do what was necessary without making it into a performance. Dorn's famous emotional severity, his difficulty expressing vulnerability, his tendency to process everything through the medium of work and construction, rather than through anything that resembles honest emotional communication, would have made him almost uniquely well-suited to benefit from Sanguinius's survival. Not because Sanguinius would force him to feel things more openly. Dorn would hate that and resist it in the specific stubborn way that only Dorn can. But because Sanguinius is one of the few beings who could sit with Dorn in his worst grief without trying to fix it or minimize it or redirect it into productivity, and who Dorn might actually accept the presence of, in the original timeline, Dorn carries the guilt of the Emperor's wounding for the rest of his very long life. He was the one responsible for the Imperial Palace's defenses. The Emperor was wounded on his watch. He will never fully let go of that, and the absence of Sanguinius means he has one fewer brother to share it with. The Dorn of the original timeline is a lonelier figure than his immense capability and his certainty of purpose might suggest. And losing Sanguinius, in the same catastrophe that put the Emperor on the throne, compounds that loneliness in ways that shape his subsequent behavior in subtle and not entirely positive ways. With Sanguinius present, Dorn has a counterpart in the reconstruction who genuinely understands what happened on Terra in a way that Guilliman, who was not there for the worst of it, cannot. Two survivors of the thing that broke everything. That shared experience changes the dynamic of the post-heresy Primarch Council in ways that are hard to quantify, but easy to feel in the texture of how those relationships play out. Leman Russ is another case worth examining carefully. Russ is the most purely emotional of the Primarchs in some ways, driven by instinct and loyalty and a kind of fierce love that expresses itself almost entirely through aggression and violence, because those are the tools he has available. His grief for Sanguinius in the original timeline is genuine and raw, and it contributes to the specific quality of his later actions, the willingness to disappear into the Eye of Terror on what amounts to a personal quest driven partly by loss. Whether the loss of Sanguinius is one of the factors that tips Russ toward that disappearance is uncertain, but it is not nothing. With Sanguinius alive, Russ has a brother who survived the worst of it and can look him in the eye without flinching. Russ responds to that. He is not naturally comfortable with the kind of quiet presence that Sanguinius offers, but the specific experience of seeing someone he expected to be dead still standing has an effect that goes beyond the purely personal. It makes certain things feel less inevitable. It suggests that the darkness is not absolute, and for Russ, who is always fighting against the pull of his own most despairing instincts beneath the aggression, that suggestion has genuine value. The Khan is perhaps the most interesting case among the surviving Primarchs in terms of how Sanguinius's survival changes things. Jagatai Khan is one of the most enigmatic figures in the heresy period. A brilliant tactician and genuinely wise observer of the human condition, who has never quite been given the credit he deserves in the setting's broader narrative. The Khan's central quality is a commitment to freedom, to motion, to refusing to be constrained by categories and expectations that do not serve the actual purpose they claim to serve. He approved of the Codex Astartes, interestingly, not because he shared Guilliman's organizational philosophy, but because he saw the breaking of the legions as a kind of liberation rather than a constraint. The Khan would have appreciated Sanguinius's survival on multiple levels. He and Sanguinius are not often paired in the lore, but they share certain qualities: an emotional intelligence, a resistance to the kind of rigid doctrine that other Primarchs were more comfortable with, a genuine interest in the humans around them as individuals rather than as assets. The Khan, in a surviving Sanguinius scenario, is someone with an unexpected ally on points that matter to him, and that shifts some of the post-heresy political calculations in ways that benefit the reconstruction. Corvus Corax is the case that might be most dramatically changed by Sanguinius's survival, because in the original timeline, Corax's trajectory after the heresy is one of the most tragic in the entire Primarch canon. He spent the heresy carrying the weight of Istvan V, the drop site massacre where his legion was nearly destroyed, the loss of over 75,000 of his warriors in a single catastrophic betrayal. He tried to rebuild, resorted to desperate genetic experiments that went badly wrong and produced his own kind of monsters, and eventually disappeared into the Eye of Terror in what amounted to a search for penance that he could never quite fully articulate. Corax was haunted by loss in the specific way that someone who has seen too many of their people die because of a mistake they made is haunted. The weight of Istvan V never left him. In the original timeline, Sanguinius's death on top of everything else is one more loss in a life that has accumulated too many of them, and it contributes to the general despair that eventually sends Corax into the Eye. With Sanguinius present, there is someone who can talk to Corax about this. Not to make it better, because nothing makes it better. And Sanguinius is wise enough to know that trying to fix grief is usually worse than simply being present with it. But to say, I have also seen too many people I loved die because of what this war was, and I am still here. And the fact that I am still here is not a betrayal of the ones who are not. That is the kind of thing that can keep someone in the room when everything in them wants to leave it. Whether Corax disappears into the Eye in this timeline is genuinely uncertain. The specific forces that drove him there were complex and not simply about loss. But the general shape of his trajectory is different when he has a specific peer relationship with someone who has survived comparable extremity and stayed. Then there is Lion L. Johnson. The Dark Angel's Primarch is one of the most complicated figures in the setting, alternately brilliant and frustrating, capable of extraordinary compassion and cold-blooded manipulation within the same chapter of the same story. He and Sanguinius had a complicated relationship in the Heresy period, managed largely through the mediation of Guilliman, when the Lion's tendency toward unilateral action created problems that Guilliman's authority alone could not solve. Sanguinius stepped in repeatedly to prevent the Lion's most self-destructive impulses from causing permanent damage to the coalition of loyalists trying to hold Imperium Secundus together. In the original timeline, the Lion eventually goes into stasis in the heart of the rock, tended by the mysterious Watchers in the Dark, and only recently returned in the 42nd millennium. The reasons for his retreat are complex and involve guilt around the fallen angels, his own version of the post-heresy processing that seems to have required most of the surviving Primarchs to leave the stage in some form. With Sanguinius present across those centuries, the Lion's retreat might still happen, but the timing and the nature of it might be different. The Lion, for all his difficulties, has a genuine respect for Sanguinius that was established during Imperium Secundus. That respect creates a channel of communication between them that does not exist between the Lion and most of his other brothers. It might not prevent the Lion's eventual withdrawal, but it might delay it or shape it in ways that leave him better positioned to be useful when he returns. None of these individual relationship changes is dramatic in isolation, but taken together, the survival of Sanguinius creates a post-heresy Primarch brotherhood that is slightly more cohesive, slightly less catastrophically fractured, slightly more capable of productive collaboration on the genuinely enormous project of rebuilding the Imperium. That collaboration, spread across the crucial first century or two after the heresy, when the institutions of the Imperium were being designed from the ground up, has effects that compound over the full 10,000 years. Section 14. The Blood Angels in Combat, a chapter transformed. We have talked a great deal about the cultural and genetic consequences of Sanguinius's survival for the Blood Angels and their successor chapters. But there is a dimension we have not fully addressed yet, which is what they look like on the battlefield when the Black Rage is not a factor. In the original timeline, Blood Angels' tactics are shaped significantly by the need to manage the Rage as a battlefield element. The Death Company is deployed deliberately in specific situations where their uncontrollable fury can be channeled productively against the right kind of enemy. But it also represents a permanent tactical constraint, a unit of warriors who cannot be held in reserve, cannot retreat, cannot be given nuanced orders, and who must be placed where they will do maximum damage before the Rage burns them out. The chapter's tactical flexibility is always partially constrained by the need to account for the Death Company, and for the probability that additional Marines will fall to the Rage during extended campaigns. Remove that constraint, and the Blood Angels become something different as a fighting force, not simply better in the sense of having more warriors available, but tactically more flexible, able to make a wider range of operational choices without the Rage complicating the calculus. The Blood Angels' genuine tactical strengths have always been speed, assault, and individual warrior quality. They favor jump-pack-equipped infantry, close combat, and the kind of fast-strike operations where their individual Marines' superior capability is the decisive factor rather than weight of numbers. They hit hard, fast, and personally. They go where the fight is thickest, not because they have to, but because that is what they are built for. Those strengths are more fully realizable without the Black Rage as a complication. A Blood Angels captain who does not have to plan around the possibility of losing veteran warriors to the Rage on the eve of battle can think more clearly about the campaign itself. A chapter master who is not constantly calculating the Rage's impact on the chapter's effective strength can make longer-term operational commitments. A Blood Angels force fielded without the Death Company's particular requirements, hovering over every tactical decision, is simply a more predictable and therefore more powerful instrument in the hands of whoever is commanding it. Over the 10,000 years of the Imperium's history, the Blood Angels and their successor chapters in this scenario have also been accumulating wisdom and veteran experience at a different rate than in the original timeline. In the original, that accumulation is constantly interrupted by the Rage-taking veterans who had decades of hard-won battlefield knowledge and destroying them. In our scenario, warriors who would have fallen to the Rage instead continue serving, continue learning, continue passing their knowledge to the generations behind them. This is not a trivial advantage. The most effective military forces in history have always been the ones with deep institutional memory, with the ability to learn from past mistakes and build on past successes at a rate that exceeds the enemy's ability to develop countermeasures. The Blood Angels in the original timeline are constantly losing that institutional memory to the Rage. In this timeline, they are building it continuously. Sanguinius himself in combat is the ultimate expression of what the Blood Angels represent. The lore is consistent that he was among the very best warriors in the Primarch roster, perhaps the best in certain specific categories, particularly aerial combat and the kind of fast, close-range engagement where his wings gave him a three-dimensional mobility that other Primarchs could not match. He was not the most powerful Primarch in terms of raw physical strength, but he was one of the most dangerous because of the combination of speed, skill, psychic ability, and the particular quality of focused, intelligent fury that he brought to a personal fight. In the 41st millennium of this scenario, with 10,000 years of additional experience on top of everything he already knew, that capability is extraordinary. He has fought every kind of enemy the galaxy has produced across a time span that dwarfs the careers of even the oldest non-Primarch warriors. He has adapted, evolved, developed responses to threats that did not exist when he was first in battle. He is, by any reasonable measure, the most experienced single combatant alive. And on the rare occasions when he takes to the field personally, the psychological effect on everyone around him, allies and enemies alike, is the same as it has always been. Allies find something more to fight for. Enemies find their certainty, wavering in ways they cannot entirely account for. His presence changes the quality of the air in a battlefield, the way that certain natural phenomena change the quality of light, something you cannot quite name but cannot fail to notice. The Tyranid threat in particular is worth considering in the context of a surviving Sanguinius. The Tyranid hive fleets that begin reaching the galaxy in significant numbers in the later part of M41 represent a kind of threat that the Imperium is structurally poorly prepared for, because they are not susceptible to the kind of targeted leadership decapitation that works against most other enemies, and they adapt in real time to tactics that worked against them previously. The devastation of Baal in the original timeline, when Hive Fleet Leviathan descends on the Blood Angels' home system, nearly destroys the chapter. In our survival scenario, the defense of Baal has a different character. Sanguinius is present in his own home system when the Hive Fleet arrives. The Blood Angels, at full strength and undiminished by millennia of Black Rage attrition, can field a significantly larger and more experienced force for the initial defense. And Sanguinius's specific qualities, including his psychic sensitivity and his 10,000 years of tactical experience, make him genuinely effective against a threat type that does not have the kind of fixed vulnerabilities that he would normally exploit. The devastation of Baal in this timeline is still a catastrophe by normal standards. Leviathan is enormous, and the resources the Imperium can bring to any specific system are always finite. But it does not go as badly. The Blood Angels do not end the campaign facing extinction, and requiring emergency transfusions of warriors from their successor chapters to maintain their numbers. They are battered and diminished, but they survive in a form that still looks like the Blood Angels rather than the ghost of them. End. Section 15. The Theology of a Living Angel. Deeper thoughts on faith and presence. We touched on the religious dimension of Sanguinius's survival earlier, but the topic is deep enough that it deserves additional exploration. Because the way the setting handles religion, the complicated and sometimes self-contradictory relationship between the Emperor's stated philosophy and the faith that springs up around him despite it, is one of the most interesting aspects of Warhammer 40,000, and a living Sanguinius changes it in ways that are subtle but far-reaching. The Emperor was explicitly and aggressively atheist. He did not simply tolerate religion. He despised it, with the specific hostility of someone who had watched religions cause enormous harm across thousands of years of human history, and had concluded that the psychological mechanisms they exploit are better addressed by genuine understanding, rather than supernatural reassurance. He built the imperial truth as a deliberate counter-program to religion, a philosophical framework that was meant to provide the ethical foundation and the shared meaning that religion typically provides without any of the metaphysical claims. The problem was that the Emperor himself was, by any reasonable definition, divine. He was a psychic entity of literally galactic significance. He was the Astronomicon, the beacon that made faster-than-light navigation possible across the Imperium. His will sustained the machinery that kept the warp navigable for humanity. Whether you want to call that divine in a theological sense, or simply extraordinary in a naturalistic one, is somewhat semantic, because the practical effect is indistinguishable. People who look at the Emperor can legitimately say this being is doing things that we attribute to gods in our oldest stories, and they can say it accurately. So, the imperial truth failed, not because it was philosophically incoherent, but because it was trying to deny the obvious. And when the Emperor went on the throne and could no longer actively enforce his position, the faith flooded in, because it was always there under the surface, held back by authority rather than by genuine persuasion. Sanguinius understood this dynamic better than almost any of his brothers, partly because he had faced a version of it himself on Baal. He knew what it felt like to be worshipped as divine when you knew you were not, or at least not in the way the word is usually meant. He knew the specific discomfort of being the subject of faith that you cannot fully endorse and cannot entirely prevent. And he knew, from his most intimate conversations with his father, that the Emperor's resistance to being worshipped was itself a philosophical position rather than a simple statement of fact, because the line between an entity of sufficient power and what humans mean by the word God is not as clear as the Emperor liked to pretend. In our survival scenario, Sanguinius has the opportunity, over 10,000 years, to try to shape the religious culture that develops around both the Emperor and himself in a more honest direction. Not to prevent it, because it cannot be prevented. Not to simply accept it, because accepting it entirely would be a betrayal of the Emperor's actual position. But to work within it toward a version that is less authoritarian, less prone to the kind of fanatical excess that the original timeline's ecclesiarchy is prone to, and more genuinely connected to the actual values that both the Emperor and Sanguinius themselves lived by. This is genuinely difficult political and cultural work. The institutions of the ecclesiarchy, once they have developed a few centuries of momentum and a full organizational hierarchy and considerable political power within the broader structure of the Imperium, are resistant to influence even from sources with significant authority. They develop their own internal logic, their own traditions, their own hierarchies of interpretation, and those hierarchies have a strong incentive to resist any authority that would complicate them. Sanguinius, as a living Primarch whose connection to the Emperor is more direct than any mortal could claim, has an unusual form of authority in this space that even the most powerful ecclesiarchs cannot easily dismiss. He can say, with genuine credibility, I knew the Emperor personally, and I knew what he valued and what he despised, and you are currently doing things he would have found deeply troubling. That statement, coming from a 10-foot-tall individual with wings who survived the Horus heresy and 10,000 years of the worst the galaxy could throw at him, is difficult to simply overrule. Does he use this authority consistently and effectively across 10,000 years? almost certainly not consistently. There are long periods, probably, where he is focused on military matters, or on the Blood Angels specifically, or on his ongoing dialogue with his father on the throne, and the ecclesiarchy develops without his direct attention. But at key moments, when the institutional drift toward the kind of punishing authoritarianism that the original timeline sees in the Age of Apostasy becomes visible enough to demand a response, he is present to make one. The Age of Apostasy, in the original timeline, involves a preacher king named Gog Van Dire, who simultaneously assumed control of both the ecclesiarchy and the administratum, and presided over a period of extraordinary institutional cruelty that ended with his assassination. It is one of the darkest chapters in a dark history, a demonstration of how thoroughly even institutions built on ostensibly noble foundations can be corrupted by concentrated power and insufficient accountability. In our scenario, the conditions that created the Age of Apostasy are present, because those conditions are structural, related to the concentration of institutional power in human organizations, without adequate checks on it. But the specific tipping point that allowed someone like Van Dire to arise without opposition for as long as he did might not be reached in the same way, because the living presence of a Primarch with the authority and the will to say this is wrong before the wrong becomes catastrophic changes the accountability calculation. It is also worth noting that the Blood Angels' religious culture, without the Black Rage as its organizing trauma, develops in a genuinely different direction. The original Blood Angels have a complex and beautiful but ultimately grief-organized devotional tradition built around the death of their Primarch. In this scenario, their devotion is organized around something else, around the ongoing presence of a father who is genuinely there, who can be consulted and followed and sometimes disappointed by, who represents not a perfect martyred image, but a living standard of what it means to carry their particular inheritance with integrity. That shift from death-organized to presence-organized religion is not small. It changes what Blood Angels pray for, what their rituals are designed to accomplish, what their chapter culture teaches about the meaning of sacrifice and loss. It creates a theological framework that is arguably more honest and more practically useful, because it is oriented toward living well rather than dying beautifully, toward the ongoing work of being what Sanguinius represents, rather than the permanent mourning of what was lost. And across the thousands of years and dozens of chapters that carry Sanguinius's gene seed, that theological shift in the Blood Angels' culture accumulates into something that has a genuinely different relationship with the broader cult imperialis. The Sanguinary Brotherhood becomes, in this timeline, a cluster of chapters that are deeply devout, but devout in a way that is recognizably connected to actual human experience, rather than to the kind of abstracted institutional faith that the broader ecclesiarchy sometimes becomes. They are voices within the imperial faith for something more personal, more honest, and more practically grounded. That voice, exercised over 10,000 years through the billions of contacts between Blood Angels warriors and the civilian populations of the worlds they fight on and fight for, shapes imperial religious culture in ways that are diffuse but real. It does not fix the ecclesiarchy. Nothing fixes the ecclesiarchy in the complete sense, but it provides a consistent counterweight to its worst tendencies, organized around the example of a living Primarch who carries his own darkness with dignity and his faith with intelligence, rather than with the reflexive certainty of someone who has never had to question what they believe in the specific, personal way that Sanguinius has had to question it. Section 16. The question of corruption: could Sanguinius fall? There is a question that hangs over this entire scenario that we have been somewhat carefully stepping around, and I think we have to address it directly. Could a surviving Sanguinius eventually be corrupted by chaos? The Chaos Gods were interested in him during the heresy. Kabanda, the Bloodthirster, made him a personal project across multiple battles. The daemon Kyrus suggested to Horus that Sanguinius, if turned, would be a greater servant of the dark gods than Horus himself. These are not nothing. The lore explicitly establishes that Chaos had an unusual interest in the great angel, finding in him a potential that they did not find in most of the other Primarchs. So, 10,000 years of war, 10,000 years of loss, 10,000 years of watching the thing you helped build become something that would horrify you if you saw it without the context of all the incremental steps that led there? Could that break him? Could the gradual accumulation of grief and weariness, and the specific kind of corruption that comes not from a dramatic single moment of temptation, but from the slow, grinding attrition of hope being perpetually deferred, could that eventually open a door in Sanguinius that should stay closed? The honest answer is that the possibility is real. Primarchs can fall. The heresy demonstrated that with catastrophic comprehensiveness. And the specific vulnerabilities that chaos found in each Primarch were not random. They were related to the specific strengths and values of each being, the points where genuine virtue could be twisted into something terrible by sufficient pressure applied in the right direction. For Sanguinius, the most likely vector of corruption has always been his love. The very thing that makes him extraordinary, that genuine, personal, individual love for his sons and for humanity, as more than an abstraction, is the thing that could be exploited if pressed hard enough and long enough. Loss upon loss upon loss, the specific kind of grief that comes from watching people you love die in wars, you are not winning in any permanent sense, could theoretically create the conditions for something to offer him a way to change the equation, to stop losing, to stop watching, to end the grief by ending the attachment that makes loss possible. Sanguinius would see that temptation for what it was. He is not naive. He has looked into the face of chaos more directly than almost anyone else alive, and he understands its logic from the inside out. He knows that what it offers is not freedom from loss, but a different kind of captivity, one where the loss of self is the price paid for not feeling the loss of others. He would not accept that bargain, but the pressure is real, and acknowledging it honestly is important for understanding what 10,000 years of this would actually cost him. He would not be the same being at the end of those 10,000 years that he was at the beginning of them. Nobody could be. The weariness would be visible. The marks of loss would be visible. The specific quality of joy he carried in his early years, the easiness of his warmth, and the unguarded nature of his love would be more carefully managed by the end, because he would have learned hard how much grief comes with loving freely. But the core of him, the thing that refused Horus, and refused Kabanda, and refused Kairos, and stood in the face of chaos empowered by 4 gods, and said no, that core is not accessible to corruption by the methods chaos typically deploys. The specific path to corrupting Sanguinius would have to go through something so catastrophic that it shatters his fundamental belief in the value of what he is defending. And in this timeline, where the Blood Angels are not facing extinction from a genetic curse, and the Imperium, though dark, is slightly less completely hopeless than the original, that catastrophic threshold is never quite reached. He walks the edge of it, probably more than once. There are probably centuries where he is less present, more withdrawn, working through something in himself that cannot be processed quickly. But he always comes back from that edge, because he is Sanguinius, because refusing to fall is what he does, and because, underneath everything else, he is a being who genuinely believes that the light is worth carrying, even when it costs everything, not as an abstraction, not as a philosophical position, as a lived reality that he has tested against every kind of dark the galaxy has thrown at him, and found still true. That belief, 10,000 years old and carrying the weight of every test it has survived, is perhaps the most powerful thing in the setting. Section 17. Final Reflections. What makes the angel matter? We have now spent an extraordinary amount of time with the question of what Sanguinius surviving would have meant. And as we approach the end of this journey together, I want to step back for a moment and say something about why the question matters at all. Why Sanguinius specifically, why his death specifically, sits at the center of so much of what makes Warhammer 40,000 feel the way it feels. Every tragedy in this setting is built on a version of the same foundational loss, the loss of the Emperor's original dream. The Great Crusade, for all its violence and its coercion and its many genuine failures, was oriented towards something, toward a future in which humanity was united, free from the predation of both Xenos and the supernatural, able to grow and develop and become something that the isolation of the Age of Strife had prevented it from being. The Emperor had a vision, flawed and imperfectly communicated, and often carelessly executed, but a vision nonetheless, a direction, a sense that the universe could be better than it was. That vision died on the vengeful spirit. Not when the Emperor went on the throne, because the Emperor could still theoretically recover, and his vision with him. It died with Sanguinius. Because Sanguinius was the living embodiment of the best of what the Emperor had hoped his sons would be. He was the Primarch who had genuinely internalized the moral content of the dream, rather than simply executing the military content of it. He was the one who understood not just what the crusade was doing, but why it was supposed to matter. Without him, the vision becomes an institutional document rather than a living thing. It becomes the Codex Astartes and the High Lord's Charter and the formal structures of the Adeptus Terra, which are good things, genuinely important things, but they are not the same as having the vision itself present in someone who believes it. Documents can be reinterpreted, institutions can be corrupted, structures can be turned toward ends other than the ones they were designed for. A living being who genuinely carries the original meaning of something is not so easily redirected. With Sanguinius alive, the vision lives. Not perfectly, not without compromise or adaptation, but something that is recognizably continuous with what the Emperor originally intended, survives in a form that can still resist the worst of what 10,000 years of institutional drift tends to produce. This is also why the Blood Angels are the most emotionally resonant Space Marine chapter, at least for many fans of the setting. It is not their power or their aesthetics, though those are genuinely striking. It is their tragedy. They are the sons of the most beautiful failure in the setting, carrying a curse that is simultaneously the proof of how much their father loved them and the proof of how completely the darkness can corrupt even love into something that destroys. In our survival scenario, that tragedy is less complete. The curse is diminished. The father is present. The story the Blood Angels tell about themselves is different, and therefore who they are is different. They are still beautiful. They are still marked. They are still sons of a Primarch who was fighting an impossible darkness and knew it and fought anyway. But they are not defined by loss in the same way. They are defined, in this timeline, by what it looks like to keep going when you have every reason to stop. That is, in the end, what Sanguinius represents in this entire scenario. Not the absence of darkness or the resolution of tragedy, but the specific quality of stubborn, present, eyes-open continuation that is the only honest answer to a universe that is genuinely and comprehensively dark. He survived because the story needed him to survive, even though the story chose not to let him. In our imagining of what that survival means, we find something that the original setting cannot quite offer, but that the original setting always hints at: the possibility that, even in the grim darkness of the far future, the choice to care is not futile, that the light matters even when it cannot win, that wings spread above a dying line are worth something, even when the line eventually falls. The Imperium in this scenario is still dark. The war is still without end. The costs are still staggering, and the victories are still temporary, and the darkness always comes back. But it comes back into a universe that has, somewhere in its corner, a being who has been saying no to it for 10,000 years and has not stopped. That is worth more than we can easily measure. And it is the most honest answer the scenario has to offer to the question we began with. What if Sanguinius had survived? The answer is, the Imperium would have had one more reason to believe that surviving was worth it. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that is the rarest and the most precious thing of all. If you made it all the way through this one, thank you, genuinely and without reservation. This has been one of the longest journeys we have taken together through the 40K lore, and I hope it gave you something to think about and something to feel. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you think the biggest change would have been. Tell me what I missed. Tell me which part of the scenario resonated most with you, and which part you found hardest to believe. And if you have been watching this and you are not already subscribed, now is the moment to fix that. Hit the subscribe button. There is more lore, more what-ifs, more long, quiet journeys through the darkest corners of the 41st millennium right here, and you do not want to miss what comes next. This has been a meditation on what the survival of the most beloved of the Emperor's sons would have meant for 10,000 years of human history. Until next time, stay warm, take care of each other, and watch the skies. The angel would want you to. Section 18. The Space Marines Who Never Fell, Individual Warriors Saved. One of the most quietly moving aspects of imagining the Blood Angels without the Black Rage is thinking about the individual warriors who, in the original timeline, fall to it. Not in the abstract, not as a statistic of attrition, but as specific people, specific lives, specific accumulations of experience and relationship and skill who are lost not to the enemy, but to their own genetics. The lore gives us some names. Lamartes, the guardian of the lost, who in the original timeline falls to the Black Rage but fights it to a partial standstill, walking the edge between the rage and lucidity in a way that is simultaneously heroic and deeply tragic. He leads the Death Company in battle because he is one of the only beings capable of communicating with warriors in the grip of the rage. In our scenario, Lamartes never falls to the rage. He is a chaplain of extraordinary capability, and his long life of service, whatever form it takes without the specific crisis of the Black Rage to organize his purpose, produces someone who is shaped differently, but no less significant. Mephiston, the chief librarian, who in the original timeline is notable precisely because he overcame the Black Rage through sheer psychic willpower during the Plague of Madness, emerging as something that may be more than human in ways that are never quite fully explained. His specific form of greatness is entirely contingent on the Black Rage being present for him to overcome. In our timeline, without the Black Rage, Mephiston is a different figure. He is likely still extraordinary. The Blood Angels librarian tradition is powerful, independent of the rage, but his specific quality of having survived something that should have destroyed him and emerged from it as something that defies normal categories is simply not available to him in the same way. He might be a great librarian, possibly the greatest, but he is not Mephiston, the Lord of Death, in the same sense. This is actually an interesting complication in the survival scenario that is worth sitting with. Not every consequence of Sanguinius surviving is simply better. Some of the things that make the Blood Angels extraordinary in the original timeline, some of the specific qualities and individuals that emerge from their particular tragedy, do not exist in the same form in a timeline without that tragedy. The Death Company itself is one of the most striking examples of this. In the original timeline, the Death Company represents something genuinely beautiful alongside its tragedy. It is the Blood Angels' answer to an impossible situation, a way of honoring brothers who have been destroyed by something that cannot be stopped, of making their final hours meaningful, of turning a genetic catastrophe into something that at least has dignity. The aesthetics of the Death Company, the black armor and the red crosses, and the chaplains who walk beside them speaking words of comfort into ears that may not be hearing them in any conventional sense, is one of the most emotionally resonant things in the entire Blood Angels aesthetic. In our survival scenario, the Death Company, as it exists in the original timeline, does not exist. There may be a unit by that name, possibly organized around warriors who have succumbed to the worst expressions of the Red Thirst and need to be given a final, honorable purpose before they become dangerous to their own brothers. But it is not the same unit. It does not carry the same weight. The particular combination of tragedy and beauty that makes the original Death Company what it is requires the Black Rage to exist, and the Black Rage requires Sanguinius's death to exist. This is worth acknowledging honestly. In imagining a timeline where Sanguinius survives, we are not imagining a timeline where the Blood Angels simply gain everything they have and lose nothing. They gain the absence of the Black Rage's catastrophic drain on their chapter. They gain a living father. They gain stability and presence and the management of the Red Thirst rather than the compounding crisis of the original timeline. But they lose the specific beauty that was born from the specific tragedy, and that loss is real, even if the loss was itself a loss. The balance is heavily in favor of the survival. But being honest about what is lost, even in a timeline that overall goes better for the Blood Angels, is important for understanding what we are actually discussing when we imagine this scenario. Section 19. The Astronomicon and the Warp Psychic Consequences. We have not yet fully addressed one of the most technically complex dimensions of Sanguinius's survival, its potential effects on the warp itself, on the Astronomicon, and on the broader psychic landscape of the galaxy. The warp and the materium are deeply interconnected in this setting. Events of sufficient psychic magnitude create changes in the warp that persist, sometimes for millennia. The death of Sanguinius, a primarch of extraordinary psychic power, aboard a ship invested with the power of 4 chaos gods, at the moment when the Emperor was simultaneously inflicting and receiving mortal wounds, was one of the most psychically intensive events in the history of the galaxy. The effects of it are still present in the gene seed of the Blood Angels 10,000 years later. The warp remembered that moment. In our scenario, that event does not happen in the same way. The Emperor still goes on the Golden Throne. The battle between the Emperor and Horus is still one of the most psychically catastrophic confrontations in the galaxy's history. The warp is still marked by it. But the specific element of Sanguinius's death scream, the psychic wave that hit every Blood Angel simultaneously and was powerful enough to imprint a dying Primarch's last moments into their genetic material, does not occur. What this means for the warp in the short term is probably modest. The warp is influenced by emotion and experience on a cosmic scale, and the deaths and tragedies of the heresy period collectively generate enormous amounts of warp activity, regardless of this one event. But in the longer term, the absence of the Black Rage's ongoing psychic dimension might have subtle effects. The Black Rage is not purely a biological phenomenon. It has a warp component. The psychic echo of Sanguinius's death continues to resonate in the immaterium, and the Blood Angel's ongoing experience of the Black Rage, repeated across millions of warriors across 10,000 years, contributes a specific quality of grief and rage to the warp's emotional atmosphere in regions the Blood Angels operate in. That is a real thing in the lore. The way that sustained patterns of psychic activity from large groups of people shape their local warp environment over time. Remove the Black Rage, and that specific psychic contribution is absent. The warp in regions of Blood Angels' activity is still affected by the emotions and experiences of those warriors, who are still marked and complex and carry significant psychic weight. But the specific distortion of repeated mass reenactment of a Primarch's violent death is not there. The local warp environment in those regions is subtly different in ways that might make them marginally safer to navigate and marginally less attractive to the specific categories of daemon that feed on that kind of grief and rage combination. This is a small change in the context of the galaxy-spanning warp activity that determines the broader psychic weather of 40K. But small changes in the warp, maintained consistently over 10,000 years, can compound into something more significant. The regions the Blood Angels and their successors are traditionally responsible for defending might, in this timeline, be slightly cleaner psychically than they are in the original, slightly less prone to the daemonic incursions that prey on Blood Angels' associated warp distortions. Sanguinius himself, as a living psychic entity of Primarch magnitude, also contributes to the warp's landscape in ways that a dead Sanguinius does not. His presence, sustained over millennia, creates a psychic anchor in the materium that the forces of chaos have to navigate around, rather than exploiting the vacuum created by his absence. He is not a passive element in the warp's landscape. His continued life is itself a form of resistance to the Chaos God's preferred narrative. The story that says everything the heresy started tearing down has been completely torn down, and there is nothing of the original vision left. The Chaos Gods are aware of him. They have always been aware of him, since before he was born, since the moment the Emperor began creating the Primarchs, and they saw the shapes of what was being built. His survival is a specific irritant to their preferred order of things, because he represents an argument against the permanence of their victory that cannot be dismissed as mere sentiment or institutional memory. He is alive. He remembers. He continues to act as though the vision the Emperor had was not entirely lost. They would not stop trying to corrupt or destroy him across 10,000 years. The pressure they apply to him through agents and dreams, and the specific vulnerabilities that his love and his grief create, is real and sustained. He withstands it, as we discussed earlier, because the core of him that refused chaos at the vengeful spirit is not accessible to the methods they have available. But the effort is real, and the cost of withstanding it is real, and that cost is part of what makes him quieter and more cautious in the later centuries than he was in the earlier ones. His presence also changes the political calculations of the Chaos Gods to some degree. In the original timeline, the death of Sanguinius is effectively a free win for them. They get to remove their most dangerous potential convert and their most compelling symbolic opposition in one action, and the grief and the black rage that follow are bonuses. In our scenario, they have to keep spending resources and attention on a being that has already demonstrated his resistance to everything they can try. That is a tax on their attention. And while the Chaos Gods are not limited in the way mortals are by resource constraints, sustained attention on one specific being is attention not being directed at other opportunities. Over 10,000 years, the cumulative effect of Sanguinius, requiring the Chaos Gods to maintain an ongoing investment in trying to deal with him, while never quite succeeding, is not nothing. It is one more small friction in the machinery of the long war. Section 20. A final meditation. What it means to survive. The last thing I want to say about this scenario is something personal, about what the question itself tells us about why we are drawn to the 40K setting. Warhammer 40,000 is not a hopeful setting. It tells you that in the opening text of every book, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. The explicit premise is that things are as bad as they have ever been and are probably going to get worse, that every victory is temporary and every sacrifice is insufficient, and the darkness is not going to be defeated in any final sense. The setting is built on the aesthetic of everything beautiful being broken and everything noble being corrupted, and even the most heroic sacrifice, leaving only a smoldering ruin where something better should have been. And yet people love it, deeply, passionately, in ways that go beyond enjoying a fictional setting for its entertainment value. There is something in the grimdark that resonates with people on a level that requires explanation. I think part of the answer is that the grimdark is honest in a way that more conventionally hopeful fictional settings are not. It acknowledges the reality of how resistant the universe is to improvement, how easily institutions designed for good purposes can be turned toward terrible ones, how quickly the memory of what something was supposed to be can be replaced by a distorted version that serves the interests of whoever controls the record. It acknowledges all of that without asking you to pretend it is not true. And within that honesty, the specific tragedy of Sanguinius matters, because it is the tragedy of something real being irreversibly lost, not a convenient loss, not a tragedy that sets up a triumph, just a loss. The most beloved of the sons is gone, and the curse he left behind is one of the things that makes the setting as dark as it is, and there is no arc that brings him back and makes it right. What our what-if scenario does is ask, what if the loss had not been total? What if one of the irreversible losses had been replaced by a survival? And what would that survival have meant? And the answer the scenario provides is not that surviving Sanguinius fixes the setting or resolves the grimdark or produces a happy ending. The answer is that it changes the quality of the darkness by changing what survives within it. The darkness is still there. The war is still there. The costs are still staggering. But there is one more light that should not still be burning anyway. One more voice saying no to the final outcome. One more reason why the people who fight and die in the Emperor's name have something to fight for that is not purely abstract. In the end, that is what Sanguinius represents to the fans who love him. The possibility that even in the worst possible universe, something genuinely good can survive long enough to matter. He does not represent the defeat of the darkness. He represents the refusal to stop being what you are in the face of it, which is, when you think about it, the most heroic thing possible. And when we imagine him surviving, we are imagining what it would look like if that refusal had consequences. If the choice to say no to the darkness and stay human and stay present and keep caring all the way to the end had actually changed things. If the weight of that kind of commitment, sustained over an impossibly long time, had actually bent the galaxy even slightly towards something better, it would not fix the 41st millennium. But it would mean the 41st millennium was different, was better by exactly the amount that one living, caring, stubborn refusal to be extinguished can make it better. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, and the grinding machinery of an institution that has been consuming its own people for 10,000 years in the name of protecting them, that one living light, stubbornly refusing to go out, is actually worth an enormous amount. It is worth exactly as much as the light of hope is worth in a dark room, which is, as anyone who has ever sat in the dark knows, everything. Thank you for the time you have spent in this story with me. I genuinely love these explorations of the lore and what it means and why it matters to us, and this one was particularly meaningful to spend time with. Sanguinius is one of those characters who deserves more than the ending the setting gave him. and thinking about what a different ending might have looked like was a privilege. Leave a comment and share where you are in the world and what time it is where you are watching this from. I want to know who is here and where you are in the world. And if you think of something I missed, something about how surviving Sanguinius would have changed the 41st millennium that we did not get to today, absolutely put it in the comments. The conversation is always the best part. Subscribe if you have not. Hit the notification bell, and I will see you in the next one. For Sanguinius, for Baal, for the Emperor. Bonus section. The Voices of the Suns. How Blood Angels Commanders Change. To bring this entire exploration to its most intimate conclusion, let us spend a moment with the specific characters in Blood Angels' history who are shaped most profoundly by the presence or absence of their Primarch, because these are the figures who most directly translate the survival scenario into human-scaled terms. Commander Dante, Chapter Master of the Blood Angels, is in the original timeline the oldest living Loyalist space marine who was not interred in a dreadnought. He was born more than 1,000 years before the events of the 41st millennium. He has served as chapter master for over a millennium. He has led the Blood Angels through countless campaigns and crises, including the catastrophic devastation of Baal, when Leviathan descended on the home system and nearly destroyed everything. He wears the death mask of Sanguinius, a perfect recreation of the Primarch's face, as his helm, a custom so ancient that most Blood Angels have genuinely stopped thinking of the face as a mask, and begun thinking of it as the face itself. Dante's defining characteristic, beyond his extraordinary longevity and his almost preternatural skill as a commander, is the weight he carries. The weight of the Black Rage claiming brothers he has known for centuries. The weight of leading a chapter that is, in some fundamental sense, slowly dying even as it fights. The weight of being the custodian of a legacy whose source is gone and whose most painful element cannot be addressed or resolved or outrun. He is a melancholy figure even in his greatest moments, and that melancholy is directly connected to the shape of the original timeline's Blood Angels history. In our survival scenario, Dante still exists, still has an extraordinary career of service, but carries a different weight. He is not the custodian of a dying legacy. He is the chapter master of a chapter that has a living Primarch, which creates an entirely different set of demands and relationships. He is the figure who translates between the angelic scale of Sanguinius's existence and the operational reality of running a chapter of 1,000 Marines. He coordinates the Blood Angels' military activities in a way that complements, rather than replaces Sanguinius's occasional direct involvement. That relationship, between a chapter master who has served for a millennium and a Primarch who has been present for 10,000 years, is one of the most interesting human-scaled stories the survival scenario generates. Dante would know, better than almost anyone, what Sanguinius costs himself by staying. He would see the marks of 10,000 years on someone who looks, outwardly, almost unchanged from the images in the chapter's oldest archives. He would understand that the presence is a gift and a sacrifice simultaneously, and that understanding would shape how he serves his Primarch in ways that go beyond simply executing strategic decisions. The relationship between a Blood Angels chapter master and a living Sanguinius would also be the relationship between a son who knew his father and a descendant who knew him only through legacy. Dante, in the original timeline, relates to Sanguinius, as every Blood Angel does, through the gene seed, through the chapter's traditions, through the memories encoded in the Red Thirst and the Black Rage. In our timeline, he can relate to Sanguinius as a person. He can disagree with him. He can tell him when he is wrong. He can, on the rare occasions when Sanguinius needs to be told that what he is proposing will not work the way he thinks it will, say so with the authority of someone who has been actually running the chapter through the specific conditions Sanguinius is proposing to address. That dynamic, the tension between the Primarch's authority and the chapter master's operational knowledge, is one of the most productive tensions available to a chapter with a living Primarch. It is also one of the things that makes the Blood Angels in this timeline more genuinely flexible and adaptive than their counterparts in the original. They have a living source of the deepest possible strategic wisdom, combined with a human-scaled leadership structure that translates that wisdom into operational reality through the filter of current conditions. That is a more resilient organizational structure than either alone would produce. Corbulo, the sanguinary high priest, is another figure whose purpose changes substantially in this scenario. In the original timeline, Corbulo's defining characteristic is his obsessive search for a cure to the Blood Angel's genetic curse. He has devoted his life to it. He is the keeper of the Red Grail, the most sacred artifact of the sanguinary priesthood, and his work with Gene Seed is the most advanced and dedicated in the Blood Angel's history. He has not found the cure, because in the original timeline there is no cure to find, but the search itself has produced genuine knowledge and genuine progress. In our survival scenario, Corbulo's work continues, but with an extraordinary resource available to him that was never available before: a living Primarch who is willing to work directly with the sanguinary priesthood to understand and manage the Red Thirst. The collaboration between Corbulo's scientific understanding of the Gene Seed's mechanics and Sanguinius's intimate, first-person knowledge of what the thirst actually feels like from the inside produces research that neither could accomplish alone. The result, as we discussed earlier, is probably not a cure, but it is a management protocol that is substantially more effective than what the Blood Angels have in the original timeline, and the process of developing it creates a relationship between the sanguinary priesthood and the Primarch that is one of the most important relationships in the chapter. Asterath the Grim, the High Chaplain who serves as the Great Redeemer, whose role in the original timeline is to seek out Blood Angels who have fallen to the Black Rage and grant them the Emperor's mercy, is perhaps the most fundamentally changed figure in this scenario. His entire purpose in the original timeline is organized around the Black Rage. He is the angel of death for fallen angels, the last kindness granted to brothers who have been lost to something that cannot be recovered from. His ceremonial tools and his titles and his entire identity within the chapter are built around this function. Without the Black Rage, Astoreth's role does not exist in the same form. The High Chaplain of the Blood Angels in this timeline serves a different purpose. Organized around the Red Thirst's management and the spiritual care of warriors fighting their own nature rather than the last rites of warriors who have already lost that fight. That is a less tragic role, but not necessarily a less important one. The spiritual weight of managing the thirst across an entire chapter's worth of warriors, across their centuries-long careers, is enormous, and the specific qualities that the original Asterath figure represents, the willingness to do the hardest things, to be present in the worst moments, to serve where others cannot, are still needed in this different form. These individual figures illustrate the same truth across different scales. The survival of Sanguinius does not simply make the Blood Angels better in a linear sense. It changes who they are, which changes what kinds of greatness they can produce, and what kinds of tragedy they are spared, and what kinds of loss they find instead. The balance is strongly in favor of the survival, for them and for the Imperium. But the change is real and complete, and reaches into every corner of what it means to be a son of the Great Angel. And that, ultimately, is why the question of Sanguinius's survival matters so much to us. Not because we want the Grimdark to go away, not because we want simple victories and clean endings, but because the Blood Angels, at their best, represent a specific argument about what it means to carry darkness with dignity, to fight it with love rather than with hatred, to remain yourself in the face of something that wants to unmake you. And Sanguinius is the source of that argument, the father of it, the one who lived it first and gave it to his sons through the specific inheritance of his gene seed and his example. When we imagine him surviving, we are imagining what it looks like when the source of that argument does not get silenced, when the light that kindled all those other lights is still present. When the angel who taught his sons how to carry darkness with wings instead of chains is still, even 10,000 years later, still here, still spreading those impossible wings above the dying line, still making people find one more reason to fight, still, against all reasonable expectation, still the great angel, still the brightest one. Supplementary thoughts. The wider galaxy responds. There is one dimension of the survival scenario we have not fully addressed: how the non-human factions of the galaxy would respond to a living Sanguinius across 10,000 years, because the 40K setting is not simply humanity versus chaos. It is a galaxy full of ancient and powerful civilizations with their own interests and their own read on what the presence of a surviving Primarch means for the balance of everything. The Aeldari craft worlds are perhaps the most politically complex responders to Sanguinius's survival. The Aeldari have been watching the Primarchs since before the heresy began. Their Farseers read the skein of fate with more precision than any human psyker, and the death of Sanguinius was a predicted event in some of their more pessimistic readings of the timeline's near future. His survival represents an unpredicted deviation, something the skein did not show, and that kind of variance from foreseen outcomes is deeply significant to the Aeldari. It suggests either that the future is less fixed than their theological framework assumes, or that something shielded this outcome from the Farseer's sight in ways that warrant investigation. For the Aeldari, Sanguinius is also a psychically visible figure on a scale that most humans simply are not. His warp presence is significant enough that he registers in Farseer visions the same way that other Primarchs do, as a bright and complex node in the skein of probability. His continued existence across 10,000 years means that certain Aeldari factions, which, in the original timeline, would have shifted their strategic calculations after his death to account for his absence, instead have to maintain a read on a living element. Some factions might see in a surviving Sanguinius a potential ally against chaos of unusual reliability. He has already demonstrated, more definitively than any other being alive in the post-heresy period, his resistance to chaos corruption. He has 10,000 years of track record. The Aeldari, who value demonstrated reliability above almost everything in potential allies, would note this. The Dark Eldar of Camorra would have a different perspective. They are interested in Sanguinius, the way they are interested in any being of extraordinary psychic and physical power, as a potential acquisition, or failing that, a potential complication for their schemes. The Blood Angels have historically been among the more aggressive enemies of the Dark Eldar raids, and a Blood Angels line at full strength, without the Black Rage draining their numbers, is a more formidable obstacle to Camorra's predations in the regions they operate. The Dark Eldar would not celebrate his survival, and certain of their more ambitious archons might make attempts on him across the millennia that are worth noting, even if none of them succeed. The Necrons, awakening in their tomb worlds across the centuries, would perceive Sanguinius with the detached curiosity of beings who remember the galaxy before humanity existed in it, and who view everything through the lens of what it means for their own return to dominance. A living Primarch is an anomaly to them, something outside their calculations of what the modern galaxy should contain, and they would study him with the same cold analytical interest they bring to every unknown variable. Certain Necron dynasties with a particularly complex relationship to the concept of continuity and the preservation of self across impossible timescales might find a strange kinship in the idea of a being who has maintained his essential nature through 10,000 years of change and loss. Not an alliance. Necrons do not form alliances with the living in any meaningful sense, but perhaps a specific kind of attention that produces more careful diplomatic engagement in the regions where Blood Angels and Necron territories overlap. The Tau, the youngest of the major galactic powers, developing their empire over the last several thousand years of the 41st millennium, encounter the Blood Angels through the lens of their own philosophy. The Tau value the greater good, the collective welfare of all species united under Tau leadership and guidance. A Blood Angel's force, encountered in conflict with Tau expansion, would be read through the usual lens of human militarism and religious fanaticism. But certain of the more far-sighted water-caste diplomats would recognize that the Blood Angels' culture, particularly in this timeline where the absence of the Black Rage has allowed their genuine martial nobility to develop more fully, without the shadow of their curse, represents something unusual in the Imperium. A Space Marine chapter that fights not out of fanaticism but out of something that looks, to a Tau diplomat reading the available evidence, like genuine conviction and genuine care. Whether any of this produces meaningful diplomatic outcomes in the 41st millennium is unlikely given the overall state of Imperium-Tau relations, which are hostile at the best of times. But it is a texture in the broader picture of a galaxy that contains a surviving Sanguinius. The Orcs respond to Sanguinius the way Orcs respond to everything powerful, by wanting to fight it. The Blood Angels, without the Black Rage, are slightly less entertaining to Orcs in the specific way that the original Death Company was entertaining to Orcs, that match of Berserk versus Berserk that Orcs find deeply appealing. But they are more dangerous in the ways that matter militarily, and the Orc perception of the Blood Angels as worthy opponents is not diminished by the absence of one specific mode of fighting. None of these non-human perspectives is individually decisive for the overall shape of the scenario, but together they illustrate that a living Sanguinius in the 41st millennium is a political and strategic element of the galaxy, rather than simply a military one. His presence affects the calculations of every major faction that is capable of calculation, because he is significant enough that no intelligent power can simply ignore him. That breadth of significance is itself part of what made his death so consequential in the original timeline. And in our survival scenario, it is part of what makes his continued presence so meaningful, not just for the Blood Angels or the Imperium, but for the entire shape of a galaxy that has been trying to figure out what comes after the Horus Heresy for 10,000 years. The Great Angel is one of the answers to that question, living, present, carrying everything he has always carried. 10,000 years heavier, but no less real. The wings are still white. And in a universe where everything white is eventually stained, that is the miracle.